The clatter of hooves, the swaying of the carriage, and the monologue of the attendant warder. Here the action began. The man, with his hand on his head, spoke of the Archduke's kind heart, which was ready to accept even a girl like the one before him. She involuntarily agreed with him, bowing her head obediently and covering her face with her thick, wavy dark hair. Then the warden, feeling his power over her, reached for the girl's skirt with his whip, with a smirk suggesting to check her, making sure that she was well prepared for the Archduke to enjoy her, as the man said, "Filthy body." The warden's face changed dramatically. This change was caused by the expression on the girl's face, who was not at all prepared to have someone look at her from such an angle and held up her skirt, clutching it with her fingers. The man exclaimed that she had no right to look at him like that, which was an unacceptable luxury for her. He swung his whip at the poor girl, intending to strike her and shouting that she had better continue to rot in prison for the rest of her life. His speech was interrupted by the coachman, who notified the man that they were arriving at their destination. And then the warden warned the frightened girl that the day she showed her disgusting behavior in Schneider's castle would be the day her body would hang on the gallows. Therefore, she should be courteous and keep quiet. In front of the Golden Gate, they were met by an elderly man dressed smartly. Putting his hand on his chest, he bowed and said he had been waiting for Miss Ebony's arrival. Ebony got out of the carriage and dragged her luggage with difficulty, grasping the handle with both hands and barely moving her feet. Her face looked tired and depressed, and her eyes seemed to stare at nothing at all. She bowed low to the man in greeting, saying that she was pleased to meet him, as if mistaking him for someone else. The same man asked her to raise her head, for he was only a butler. The man noticed that her luggage was very heavy, and offered to help her by extending his hand to her. The attendants froze in horror at the movement, and the girl stood frozen for a moment, staring fearfully at the butler's white-gloved hand, and recoiled from him. She was trembling and afraid to move, drops of sweat dripping down her face, while the man still took her suitcase and asked if she was all right. He received no reply, and writing off this behavior as impolite, offered to escort the lady to the manor. The girl, bowing her head, followed and apologized to the servant. The butler replied that it wasn't worth her trouble because he was just an ordinary servant, and asked her to call him Benjamin. Looking down at her feet, Ebony mumbled his name and addressed him as Sir. It seemed to the butler, too, an indescribable oddity, which he made no comment on. Stopping at the entrance, the girl wondered why Benjamin was calling her Miss. She assumed that he had mistaken her for someone else or did not know who she was at all. The servant politely replied that he was only following the orders of the Ehrherzog, his master, who had ordered him to accompany Ebony. With these words, he opened the doors in front of her. Behind them was the bright, spacious, and ornate front room of the mansion. The light shone into her eyes, dazzling her with its cleanliness and luxury. Ebony was so amazed that she held her breath and found the strength to look up a little, reaching her hand toward the large chandelier. However, her inspiration quickly settled. She had been strictly instructed to live in silence, which meant that these light emotions and admiration for beauty were something she was not allowed to experience. Gently, she lowered her hand and took hold of it, and lowered her gaze once more. A friendly grandmother came to meet them. Greeting Ebony, she assumed Miss was tired after the long journey. The girl was taken aback and bowed as low as the butler in greeting, bowing her head. The woman gently lifted her face and took her hands in hers, caring that Miss was very polite for bowing so low for an old lady like her. The grandmother introduced herself as Martha, a maid in this luxurious castle. Her face was kind, expressing happiness at the girl's arrival. Miss's hand, however, slipped from Martha's wrinkled hand. Ebony bowed to her again, and the old woman was worried that she had done too much. And Miss kept apologizing with her hands folded in front of her, saying it wasn't like that at all. Ebony said, drooping again and lowering her gaze, that all her behavior was because she was a dirty person. The servants were taken aback and wondered a little at the meaning of what she had said. But Martha pulled herself together quickly, thinking the girl was referring to her desire for a bath. She put her arm around the girl and led her to the second floor. The old woman seemed small, but she had a good grip. Martha said, quickening her pace, that as soon as the girl washed herself, she would feel much better. On the way, they met two young servants who bowed their heads to Martha in greeting. The old woman told them to greet Miss Ebony, saying that she was their master's guest from today. The servants looked up at Ebony and changed their faces. It was as if the girl had heard their scornful thoughts in her direction. Though the maids were actually very friendly to her and even offered to help her if needed, Miss stopped and froze. Everything around her seemed to be blurring, and the pictures from which the portrait faces looked at her seemed to speak to her. The eerie voices questioned her as to whether she really thought she could be a lady just because she could wear dresses and walk in the sunshine, because that and the fact that she called the castle her home would not make her one. Ebony clasped her head with her hands in fear and crouched on the floor, shuddering and hiding her face. The old woman did get the girl to the bathroom and began to apologize for greeting the maids. Taking Ebony's attack personally, she said as she prepared the bath that they hadn't had guests in a long time, and therefore they weren't ready. The girl, on the other hand, was quietly apologizing for the trouble she had caused this house. It seemed they wouldn't stop taking the blame one by one, but the bath was already ready, and Martha offered Ebony her help in washing. Then Miss unhurriedly pulled the gloves off her hands. From beneath the snow-white cloth came a trembling hand covered with scratches and cuts. The dress concealed the woman's tortured body, which was scattered with horrible scars and wounds, as if tortured. What happened to the heroine tells the story of 5 years ago, when an unprecedented murder shook the kingdom of Caucasus, completely destroying the main rule of society, which states that a woman should live under the protection of a man. For the first time in the history of Caucasus, a young woman became a criminal, sending her fiancé and father to the other world. The witch Ebony Vonik is free again. Even the moment Ebony first arrived, she was being closely watched by two young men. The blonde-haired boy named Juro Vidal asked the Ereherzog if he could really handle this girl, since the entire kingdom of Caucasus was watching her. Then the mysterious gentleman grinned and asked if he was afraid of this woman, as if he didn't doubt his decision a bit. Now the arriving miss was bathing under the care and attention of Martha, who was interested in her comfort in every way. The girl politely called her Madame Martha and thanked her. The old woman admired her kindness, but still wanted her to call her by her first name, or grandmother if she liked it better, to which Ebony waved her off in embarrassment. While Miss was receiving help, she dipped her gaze into the water now and then, wondering what was happening. When she undressed and the old lady saw her mangled poor body, Martha's face didn't express an ounce of fear or contempt, only genuine sympathy. Moreover, her expression was calm and did not express any worry from her past. The maid, as she went on with her work, reasoned aloud that perhaps the lady had been treated very differently before, and she was used to it, not knowing that there were other ways. Grandmother, with a smile on her face, wrung out the soft cloth with which Miss was washing, and went on to say that if the lady could open her heart to them, they would thank her in kind. But still, the old lady wanted Miss to see them as they were, without prejudice. Ebony looked at the maid with surprise, and addressing her first as Madam, and then correcting herself, as if remembering the old lady's request, by her name, asked if she could be here. Martha, smiling warmly and looking at the lady, replied fondly that she was already part of the family. At that moment, the Archduke was on his way to meet Ebony, who was to see him for the first time, so he prepared himself well, wearing a beautiful but not very comfortable classic dress that fit him perfectly. As he adjusted the stuffy garment, he recalled the words of his interlocutor, with whom he had watched the arrival from the window. Juro said that this woman wouldn't be afraid of anyone. After all, she had killed 2 men as an 18-year-old. But the third prince's decision regarding the murderer is rather unique. Just think of the faces of the nobles. The decision was unquestionable, hence the Archduke took her, the one no one wanted to care for. Now Ebony was only 23 years old, so he was sure he could handle her. But that wasn't the only reason. The man remembered distinctly how the woman had defended herself to the last without anyone's help, saying that people die very easily, no matter if it was a husband or a father. After snapping out of his memories, the Archduke turned to Juro Vital with a smile and began to scoff that the latter was afraid the girl would get to him too, scaring the young man with prophecies about a ghost who would want to take a job in this castle. The Archduke recalled this whole dialogue while looking at the full bright moon shining through the window directly at him. just like the local legend of Saint Schneider, which he had told his interlocutor. According to it, on the night when the moon rises, the ghost of a weeping young girl appears in the first-floor corridor. At that moment, the Archduke was brought back to Earth by the crying he had heard in reality. He sprang from his seat and ran toward the sound, eager to find out what was going on. When he opened the bathroom door, he found Ebony weeping and a worried Martha trying to comfort the inconsolable lady. The old woman was indignant that her master's actions were out of line, but the man was firm in his decision, for he had said to take care of his guest, not to make her cry. Martha persisted in her argument, saying that even if the gentleman was so right and good, that was no reason to barge into the bathroom. The fight for the right to stay in the room began. She saw and heard no one before her, and was absorbed in her own recollections of the warden's words about her low position, which she should not forget, though she was outside the walls of Spate. In her new place, she should remember her disgrace, and in any noble place she would be treated like a leper. She must live like a dead man. But they were kind to her in this house, as if they had no knowledge of her deed, of the past that had followed her around, tarnishing her reputation. She had not been here long, but she had already received so many warm words that she had not heard in all that time. All her beliefs and memories were jumbled together, and she sobbed with helplessness as she remembered that she was in fact Ebony's dirty murderer, as the warden had called her. The gentleman won the argument, but he insolently shoved the maid out the door. Martha, indignant and puzzled, did not give up, and went for help while the Archduke was alone with Ebony in the bathroom. The man hesitantly asked why the girl was crying. Ebony began to wipe away her tears in a panic, reasoning that since Martha had called this man a gentleman, he was Schneider. She apologized frantically, covering herself with her hands and saying she would get dressed, but the man stopped her, stroking her head and telling her that it was his duty to welcome guests. He offered to continue what the old woman was doing, namely washing, and sat down next to the bathtub. The embarrassed Ebony pushed herself to her feet, afraid to look at the man and refuse, but he was adamant. Taking a soft cloth, he continued to wash the girl, who knelt and said it wasn't worth it because she was dirty. The man calmly asked who dared to say such a thing. As he continued his bathing procedures, he reasoned that it was established by the law of the Caucasus country, so the girl herself probably doesn't think so. He knows well those who write such laws and despises them. These laws state that the men in power are those who possess lands and women. Now, having both, he decided to say something to Ebony. Asking her to raise her head, he firmly stated that from now on, no one would dare to say she was dirty. He promised this to her, the surprised and crying, helpless girl who sat before him. The moment of idyll was interrupted by the cries of Martha, who brought help in the person of Benjamin. The butler, covering his face with his hand, apologized for his master's ignorance and dragged the scoundrel by the collar out of the bathroom. Martha, on the other hand, returned to her seat with a serene and friendly smile, saying that Ebony was even more beautiful after her bath and that dinner would be served in her room later. After changing into a dressing gown after her bath, Ebony went to her room, which had been kindly prepared for her. The place was cozy and clean. Fragrant flowers adorned the bedside table and the linens were fresh and soft. Ebony ran her hand over it, sadly remembering the moments of deprivation and the reason why it had happened. She knew she hadn't killed those men, but somehow people didn't believe the truth that even the Supreme Court believed. She was afraid to wonder what prevented the people in that house, who were so kind to her now, from changing their minds in the blink of an eye. Shivering, she remembered that she should not ask unnecessary questions and live quietly. But the pain that had lived in her all this time kept her still. She crouched down on the floor by the bed and rested her head on her knees. But the moment of solitude was interrupted by the Archduke, who came to check on her. The lady did not notice him, but he saw clearly how uncomfortable she was. The next morning, Ebony came to the Archduke's study at his request. He had not expected to see her so soon, but he was glad to see her. Though to his questions as to whether she had slept well, Miss answered positively. He knew perfectly well that she had not. Remembering her distressed look last night, he mumbled that he didn't believe her words. But that was not why he had called her. He needed to discuss with Ebony a matter that was important to both of them. She lowered her eyes to the papers the gentleman was pointing to, and remembered that Martha had warned her at the morning assembly about the Archduke's busy schedule of dealing with important papers day and night. The man asked if she knew the details of how she had come to be here. Ebony replied that she had been granted a special pardon by His Majesty, under the terms of which the Archduke had become her patron. Well, she had a grasp of the key points. According to history, Kalkas intervened in the war with Bavel for domination of the continent, and after 7 years of bloody struggle suffered a crushing defeat. It is believed that the current Queen of Babylon has already exceeded the limits of human capability, and by fate, Kalkas has been dubbed the God of War. The man said that one of the many demands made to Kalkas as a defeated country was the release of Kalkas's witch, Ebony Wanik, and pointed directly at the girl. This meant that protecting Ebony was itself a diplomatic problem for that country. The man stepped back to the table and slammed his hand on the stack of papers on it, saying that it was now necessary to deal with all this waste paper. Handing her some sheets, he asked the lady if she was literate and asked her to read what was written there. There was genuine surprise on his face as the girl calmly and without hesitation began to read out the official documents that the Kalkas court system had appointed a guardian for her, the murderer Ebony Vanik. All legal authority is entrusted to Archduke Dante Borda-Schneider. The document was issued by the Babylonian embassy. A notarized translation into the official language was attached. The Archduke interrupted her with a question about how she had managed to read it. Ebony looked away, muttering that he had asked her to, but that was not the question. The document was written in the continental official language. Ebony thought she had just made a mistake. In fact, unlike in other countries, the education of sons and daughters was fundamentally different in Kalkasya. Aristocrats taught their daughters to read and write in the native language of Kalkas during their education, while the official continental language used in important documents was taught exclusively to men. Moreover, teaching the official language to women could be grounds for severe punishment. Ebony clutched the papers with her fingers, recognizing that it had been reckless of her to read it. She had expected punishment for her mistake, for there was no one else in the world to pin this grave crime on. From a young age, she had acquired the habit of secretly reading the books in her father's library. They were written in a complicated language, and many of the words were to her a mere set of sounds and symbols. And yet these writings became her first teachers of the official language, which she followed with eagerness and interest. When she was arrested after the fateful events, she met an interesting woman who knew that she could read poetry and promised that she would forget such frivolous male literature after hearing her teachings. So Ebony acquired a second teacher, a woman who had been convicted of teaching continental language to girls, but who was now probably gone to the other side of the world. The man exhaled and waved his hand. The fact that he was educated was not important now, and he was not going to dig into his ward's past. The question was something else, namely Ebony's thoughts after reading all those papers. The curious thing was precisely that they did not bear Mrs. Owen's signature. Ebony looked guiltily at the man, but then lowered her gaze, rubbing her elbow and pretending not to understand his intentions. And they were quite elementary, for there should be 2 signatures on papers that concerned both him, Dante Borda-Schneider, and her, Ebony Wanik. And instead of Mrs.'s signature, there was only the damned seal of the court. The girl said without looking up that she understood that, but she was used to such injustice. Then a question came to her ears that stumped her. The man asked if she was a slave. Naturally, the answer was in the negative. Then Dante tossed the papers aside in indignation and asked a second question about her inaction in claiming her rights. It seemed he was angry at what was considered quite normal in society. He demanded an answer here and now. Ebony seemed to understand his purpose. He was testing her awareness of her position in society. Then she said that the death sentence was the cause of it all. She realized that her own life, like everything else, had long ago slipped from her hands, and the only thing she could do now to preserve her life was to grovel and grovel. And why he wanted her to fight for her rights after all this, she didn't know. Because this empty agreement was unlikely to change anything in this situation. The man frowned and leaned back in his chair, waving his hand and saying that he must have made a mistake yesterday and that she could go get something to eat or do other things. Ebony froze, wondering if she had said all she needed to say, then bowed low and left the room. She had seen and heard things in prison, But this castle was full of things that were as unfathomable to her as the thoughts of her master and patron. Looking at the sunlight through the wide window, she thought about who she was. Her appearance was so atypical of a lady. A lifeless face, dark thick hair that was senselessly long, a body covered in countless scars, dressed in a beautifully delicate dress. A real filth, a stain on the reputation of this beautiful place. Her thoughts were interrupted by Martha, who took her by the hand and led her to the dining room, so that the lady could have a good meal at last, for she must have been hungry after her conversation with the gentleman. The old lady's thoughts were only of Mrs. Health, and that she should have put on a little weight. Martha swung the doors open and shouted to the chief that they had arrived. There was a brief pause, and from the kitchen came rough male cries for patience. A domestic argument began in some language unknown to Ebony, but it wasn't long before a dark man of pleasant appearance appeared in front of them, wearing the chief's uniform and carrying a lamb in his hands. He joked that the old woman would not die, especially of hunger, even if she were 200 years old, and then smiled at the girl and introduced himself as Senko, the chief cook of the castle. After exchanging pleasantries, Senko looked at the girl seriously, sizing her up. Placing a dish in front of her, he said that they usually started the morning with a light vegetable soup, but the lady should have had something else. He rushed off to the kitchen, saying he would fry some more chicken. Ebony was embarrassed, saying she'd have enough soup, but Martha declared that she would definitely enjoy Senko's cooking and slipped her a spoon. Tasting the dish, the miss smiled softly. The soup really was on point. After a while, the plate was completely empty, Martha said, putting her arm around the lady's shoulders, that she should thank the chief personally. While they waited for his return, Granny asked Ebony a question. Unpleasant though it was an important one. The old woman wanted to know if she had received any treatment before arriving at the castle, to which Ebony replied that she had been given a thorough medical examination to check for infectious diseases. But that was not the answer Martha had expected. All the pain from the many scars and bruises she was experiencing should not have been kept to herself, for it would only cause her more suffering. The old woman was worried about her condition, and Ebony had nothing to say to that. But at that moment, Senko arrived with a whole chicken. He separated a generous portion of meat for the lady and put the chicken leg on her plate. In no time, Ebony was happily eating the dish, and the chief smiled at her good appetite. The girl stood up and bowed to Senko in her usual manner, expressing her sincere gratitude for his work, saying that she really enjoyed the taste of the food he had prepared, which was one of the most delicious she had tasted. Ebony's words moved the man, and he wiped small tears from his eyes and thanked her for her appreciation and sincerity. He took her by the shoulders and asked her where the beautiful flower came from, but Martha insisted that he let her go and bring her some more snacks. Looking at all this and listening to their murmurs and their desire to feed her, the girl smiled, looking away. In her 23 years, she had never thought that she would feel someone's care and warmth again. At this moment, the matter of the wounds on Ebony's body was being discussed by the butler Benjamin with his master in his study. They were quite serious and required treatment. While the gentleman thought about it, the butler also asked if he and Miss had argued this morning. Dante brushed it off, saying that they were only talking, to which he received a condescending smile from Benjamin. In any case, all these wounds and scars would not disappear in a moment. Ebony was perfect for the Archduke's performance, but for now she had to wait for the best expert, her doctor, who was already strolling busily toward the castle. The doctor had gone up to the castle and was already waiting for Ebony in the room assigned to them. Martha led the miss there by the hand, telling her in passing that this doctor had been serving the Lord for a long time. Might seem surly at first glance, but he was still a professional in his work. Knocking, Ebony peered into the room, waiting for permission, though it was strange to give the mistress of the manor permission to enter. In front of the miss sat a stern, uniformed woman with her legs slung over her foot. It was the first time Ebony had ever seen such a short haircut on a female representative. The doctor stood up at once and took Miss by the chin, intending to examine her, but Ebony recoiled in fear and landed in a chair. Martha began to comfort her mistress, and the doctor declared that her condition was quite serious. After ordering the maid to draw all the curtains in the room, she asked Miss to lie down on the bed. Once Ebony was on the bed, the doctor began to ask her questions. pulling out the necessary equipment. Miss didn't have a medical history and hadn't already been checked for any infectious diseases, Ebony confirmed. The questions could be quite intimate, so the doctor warned the girl that all doctors ask such things, so it was better to answer honestly and without shyness for her own good. Having started listening to the girl with a stethoscope, the doctor continued asking questions. They were varied. She needed to know if Miss felt discomfort when walking and sitting, nausea, dizziness, pain even without visible wounds, and when she had had her last cycle. The doctor moved on to examining Ms. S.'s injured feet. Ebony was just about to answer as she cried out in sharp pain and lay on her side, shivering and stiffening. The doctor asked again if she felt the symptoms listed, if she had insomnia and an irregular cycle. Then, looking away, Ebony confessed that every day was agonizing because she was beaten, and she couldn't sleep on the days when the prison disposed of the dead. And ever since she'd been there, she'd lost her cycle. Martha was horrified to hear her story and covered her mouth with her hands, hiding her sincere regret and concern. The doctor nodded, like a professional, and said that she was ready to make a diagnosis. Ebony was severely malnourished, but more serious was the damage to her muscles and nerve fibers. The worst damage, however, was to her psyche, and then Ebony wondered if she could have avoided all this horror. She sometimes wondered what would have happened if she hadn't gone against her father's wishes and lived a life that was simply comfortable in the eyes of society. If things had turned out that way, she would probably have been miserable, but at least she wouldn't be in excruciating pain like she was now. But even if she had only married the man her father had chosen for her and continued her life as a submissive wife, perhaps she could have lived those moments anew. But her inner ego would still have gone against her father's will. It turned out that after the diagnosis, the girl had fallen asleep, probably from an overabundance of emotions and fatigue. She woke up from the feeling of someone's warm hand on her fingers. When she opened her eyes, she thought that she had done it all for nothing, because she had promised herself not to be a burden, and apologized, thinking that Martha was in front of her. But looking closer, she realized that the master of the castle himself was sitting in front of her, watching her. She immediately jumped up in fear and bowed on the bed, apologizing haphazardly for not recognizing his lordship and saying something unusually rude. She trembled helplessly, expecting some cruel punishment and not raising her head at him. Dante, on the other hand, looked at her dumbfounded, but with palpable sympathy. Now he knew exactly what he was dealing with, for when the doctor had finished her examination, she had visited him to inform him that the girl had suffered abuse so severe that they could not even imagine. And if Dante had indeed become Ebony's patron, the doctor, being even his subordinate, had asked for a change of heart, for he could not be her patron without fully understanding her pain and suffering. Dante carefully touched her head, comforting her, and then gently lifted her into his arms and laid her back on the bed. He decided to formally introduce himself to her, calling himself Dante Borde Schneider, an Archduke, a title he held in common with the royal family. He was involved in political matters, so he spent a lot of time abroad, and now he was her patron. He wanted to say that he was someone who would like to hear her story, so he asked Ebony to tell him a little about herself. Then the girl looked away, said her name, and said that she was a prisoner from Spate Prison, sentenced to death in the 1st degree. She was ready to tell him the exact date of her sentence, but Dante stopped her and said that wasn't exactly what he wanted to hear. Turning to her, he stated that he wanted to know her age, where she had lived before, what she liked and disliked, and other such things. The girl dutifully continued, saying that she had turned 23 this year, living in the capital city of Lanson. But when it came to her preferences, she found it difficult to answer, wondering about it already for her own sake. The doctor's words were not unfounded. Ebony's psyche was so badly damaged that she had forgotten all about her life before her imprisonment and had indoctrinated herself that a life of violence and pain was something ordinary. Then the man, remembering these admonitions, asked what Ebony would want right now. The girl wanted an answer as to why the gentleman treated her so kindly, for if it were not for his word, she would have been executed long ago. The man replied that he was her patron now and had a high enough position and a large mansion to take care of her. And Ebony looked like she really needed someone's help. He smiled and leaned over to the girl, stroking her face and asking the important question about her attitude to the situation. whether she thought it was all unfair, for not a single person had tried to justify the crime she had committed. Dante believed that what had happened was not like a premeditated murder, but looked as if the girl had been in danger. In other words, it could have been an accident resulting from self-defense. Ebony couldn't believe everything that was happening. No one believed in her innocence. No one showed an ounce of sympathy, not one person before Dante. Covering her face with her hands, she cried. Tears flowed from her eyes, and she couldn't control them. All the emotions she'd been suppressing all this time seemed to be coming out. The man didn't want to bring her to tears at all, but what he truly wished for was for her to feel a little better. Settling the girl into his lap and cradling her against his chest, making her feel cozy and safe, he asked her to cry as loudly as possible. And even if all she had done was cry since arriving at his manor, he didn't see anything wrong. Even so, everything was fine. And so it was a week later that Ebony began her course of treatment. She sat with the doctor in the room for regular checkups and apologized for not being able to get better so quickly. The doctor, however, replied that all apologies were unnecessary, for she understood that it was simply impossible to recover in one session after so many years of torment. The doctor said, as she examined the girl, that a bandage could be applied to the curved back, and that the bruises would begin to lighten with time. She looked cold-blooded at this point, but it was noticeable that she was giving her all to her mistress's health. Her calm and relaxed and sometimes aloof manner of speech was only part of her nature, but even this cold demeanor could not hide her kind heart. The doctor measured out the right amount of medicine and added that the girl's legs were of different lengths because of a crooked pelvis, which could also be corrected with a course of treatment. In addition, she advised not to eat everything the chief gave her, but only the amount that the mistress could digest. Watching Ebony dutifully swallow the medicine, the doctor asked if she was always this quiet. There was nothing to be done about the way mistress was now, but after all people usually have a period when they were raging and debauched, a certain rebellious childhood age that few people remember. Ebony, on the other hand, remembered well her father's cruel treatment of her. As soon as she said a word over his, she would be bombarded with profanity and scolding, threats of dire punishments that always materialized. So she was accustomed to keeping silent so as not to anger her father even more. To the doctor, however, she replied with a smile that she did not remember any such thing. Then, after a brief pause, the doctor pointed out that most of the people in this house were foreigners, something Ebony did not know. The Martha, Benjamin, and Saint She already knew came from abroad. Even His Excellency's knights, whom the lady had not yet met, are foreigners as well. The fact was that Mr. Archduke had been abroad for a long time, whence he had brought the people he needed. So the doctor said that Miss should not be so wary of other people, at least in this castle, for they had no idea what the rules of propriety were in Calcasieu. Whether she ran barefoot around the castle, wore pants, laughed mannishly, or sat with her legs apart, no one would judge the mistress for it. The doctor smirked at the surprised look on Ebony's face and continued her story with her own example. In Calcasieu, women are forbidden to be doctors. Here it is considered that women cannot decide such important things related to human lives. It was so absurd as to be ridiculous, since she was a medical student at Odium University, the best of the group, and even had the honor of giving the graduation speech. This means that no man has been able to reach heights of skill and scholarship equal to or higher than her. But in this country, even if someone passing by gets stabbed right in front of her, she is not allowed to perform surgery just because she is a female. Listening to the story, Ebony wondered a very logical question, namely why the doctor had come here. A clap of the palm of his hand on his forehead was heard. The doctor pressed her hand to her face in annoyance, saying that she had never imagined that His Excellency would turn out to be a member of the royal family of Calcas. And in such a situation, there was no other way to act. A subordinate must follow his master. And yet the hysteria of hopelessness haunted her for another 3 days. I had to accept that there were people with such absurd orders and views. But by all this, the doctor meant to say that Miss should not be afraid to disregard other people's opinions. Ebony wondered if these words could be believed, but still, it would be nice to believe that all those people in the castle would look at her without disgust and contempt. Besides, it had been a long time since Ebony had seen His Excellency. She couldn't even give him an answer to his question for the rest of this day. She wondered where the man might have gone, and Dante was at the event at the moment, musing on the sidelines about the incident that had turned Ebony Vonik into a suicide bomber. One of Marquis Sadel's 3 sons, Victor Sadel, heir to the title by birthright, having trained with Count Vonik's only daughter, had died 5 years ago in a tragic incident. And it had all turned against his ward. All around, they heard quiet gossip about Dante, to which he seemed to pay no attention. People talked about the Archduke's sudden appearance here, though it was known that he had returned from abroad, that he had become the patron of the very witch Vonik, and that they, laboring for the good of an already losing country in a scuffle with a state led by a woman, should silently release a suicide bomber of the 1st degree. Dante remarked with a chuckle that he was haunted by the feeling of the Queen of Babylon now sitting up and laughing loudly. In response, Juro Vital, standing nearby, asked if the Archduke knew her personally. Unfortunately, the answer was no, but Dante knew someone who did. Turning his attention in the direction of the people whispering about him, the Lord asked Juro what these curious hyenas were doing, to which he replied that they were those who wished to be remembered, based on the dozen requests he had received to that effect. The Archduke chuckled, remarking that the people called nobility do not change in this country, even with the passage of time. They were obviously waiting for someone, and Dante wanted to leave as soon as he finished talking to whoever was missing from their company. Just then, a man approached, removing the bowler from his head in greeting. He introduced himself as Marcus Sadel, the head of House Sadel. Dante glanced disdainfully at the long-awaited man who had appeared and said that as far as he could remember, the head of the Sadel family he'd seen the last time he'd been there hadn't been the man standing in front of him. Marcus didn't hesitate to clarify that Victor had been the head then, and he himself was his 2nd oldest brother. Apparently, the competition in their house is strong, and so Marcus had been extremely lucky. The head of the family, Sadel, smiled as he came in and allowed himself to ask the Archduke an immodest question about why he had become Ebony Vonik's patron. That name, spoken aloud, seemed to drown out all conversation around them, drawing attention only to their person. Marcus was sure that His Excellency was already aware of the circumstances, but he explained that this so-called witch was the murderer of the previous head of their house, Victor Sadel. There was a whisper behind Marcus. All eyes were fixed on them, waiting for an introduction. The current head of the family, on the other hand, wasn't seeking revenge by bringing it up, just expressing his concern. At least that's what he said. But Dante knew he was an excellent actor. Marcus continued to express his feigned sadness, saying that his words did not mean that he did not grieve for his brother's death, but that the circumstances themselves were shocking to him, because the murderer was not just a girl, but his fiancée. The head believed that the Archduke was not fully aware of the situation in his homeland, so he asked Dante what he knew about the witch with an obvious note of mockery. Schneider, on the other hand, was annoyed by the very fact that Marcus was acting so impeccably, so he tried to get off the subject naturally, accepting a cigar from his assistant and asking if there was anything else he should know besides this witch. His silhouette was firm and unwavering, making one think he was in control of the situation. Marcus continued his song, stirring up the debate with renewed vigor and rhetorically asking if His Excellency thought that he should devote more time and attention to politics now that he had returned to his homeland, rather than placing such a burden on himself. Dante puffed his cigar thoughtfully, pretending to consider his words carefully. The head did not back down, stating that as someone who was concerned about this, he should tell the Archduke that in the world of politics, lineage comes first, experience comes second, and then factions. What he really meant was that Dante had nothing but belonging to a noble family, so he would do well to take advantage of his status. Marcus's words angered Dante's aide, and he clenched his fists to channel the energy somewhere, while the Archduke, serenely smoking, waited for the chapter to continue its performance. Then Marcus, like a true actor on stage, spun around, wrapping his arms around the crowd gathered near them and calling for a look around. These people were all eager to gain His Excellency's favor, and it would be nice to have Dante interact with them. In his opinion, There was nothing better than political connections, but Schneider counter-questioned whether Marcus himself wanted those useful connections. Laughter was heard behind him. The head claimed that his humble persona was only seeking to help His Excellency, who seemed to have fallen into Ebony Wannick's trap. Obviously, he was just playing to the audience. An elderly man in the crowd, dutifully taking off his hat and bowing slightly, said that he had valuable information for His Excellency in connection with the subject raised. The estate of General Meister, who died in the battle, would soon be put up for auction. He had no brothers, and his wife had failed to produce an heir. Consequently, the general has no male relatives left to inherit his estate, and in accordance with the law of the land, it will soon be put up for sale. The crowd murmured, anticipating an entertaining fight for the estate, for it also housed an entire academy. Marcus bowed, asking if His Excellency would participate in the game for Meister's estate. Dante paused as he slowly extinguished his cigar. Marcus was determined to get involved himself, for not only would it improve the reputation of his house, but the mere fact of owning an academy was awesome. He waved his hand and added that he would be loyal, so if His Excellency needed information, he would be happy to share it. Dante thanked the head of the Sadel and was left alone with Juro again. After a while, he laughed, and the aide asked what had amused him so. Dante looked at Juro with a predatory glance and said that he had considered his participation in this vulgar game over the estate and had ordered a probe. The aide couldn't believe his ears, hoping the Lord was joking, but Dante had never been one to speak lightly about such things. As he headed for the exit, Schneider told him to find out the details and report back, for he intended to carve a wound the size of a manor into Marcus Sadel's pride. Following his gaze to the gentleman, Juro slammed his palm on his forehead in annoyance. They'd been back in the country not long ago, so they'd had plenty of work to do, and now this ridiculous game. The aide was almost certain that Marcus had already done something, since he was acting so confidently, and it was clearly not something honorable or honest. But Juro quickly pulled himself together, deciding to start getting information as soon as possible, because when Dante took part in such games, he forgot about the word defeat, like a snake that had spotted its prey. Dante, on the other hand, was riding in the carriage with anticipation, glad that the stage for his play was finally set. The witch, the defenseless little guest in his castle, was the centerpiece of his plan. For if the estate that Marcus Sadel coveted so much came into her possession, the news would be grand and shattering. It had been several weeks since Ebony Wannick had arrived at Schneider Castle. She had been working hard to fit in with the staff and helping with the household chores whenever possible. This day, she was working with the chief in the kitchen, helping the maids to put all the dishes in their places. Sanko couldn't bear to see her doing such work, but he couldn't stop her. After finishing cleaning the kitchen, Ebony thanked the young maids for their work as well, and received an awkward thank you in return. There was still a distance between them, even though they were the same age. Sanko thought it would be nice if they got along with her too. At that moment, there was a thud against the doorway. It was Dante, who had finally returned after his long absence. He leaned his shoulder against the wall with a smile, wondering where all the food had gone and if anyone had stolen it. The servants and Ebony herself immediately rushed to greet him. Dante noticed the hard and glorious work of the doctor, Martha and Sanko. For while he had been away, Ebony's skin color had improved, and she looked much more human now, especially her glowing eyes. Her vitality seemed to have finally returned to her. Dante noted that it was fortunate that he had met Ebony here, and said that he had a very important matter to discuss with her in his office. Walking there, Ebony stopped uneasily at the door. There were papers scattered haphazardly around, which Schneider asked her to ignore and take a seat on the sofa. The girl slowly sat down, gracefully reclining and adjusting her dress. The first thing Dante spoke of were things that pertained to the procedure discussed last time. He handed Ebony the papers and asked her to read and sign them. The girl took them and ran her eyes over the text. It was an amended version of the previous contract. The key points remained almost unchanged, but the most significant amendments were surprising and unexpected. According to them, Dante Board Schneider will serve as Ebony Wannick's protector, and Ebony Wannick must remain loyal while under his protection. In addition, all rights except the right to life will be delegated to Dante Board Schneider, and in case of conflict, Dante must act as her legal representative and defend her unconditionally. Ebony looked at Dante and the papers in confusion, which the Archduke could not help but notice, and asked if everything was all right with the text. The girl remarked that the terms were too favorable for her, and therefore did not understand the meaning of everything. Dante replied with a smile that it was the minimum, and at the moment even that was not enough, so they would adjust the clauses one by one. It would be another month or so before this contract was notarized. The most important thing was that the drafters had agreed to allow room for Ebony's signature, for which the Archduke's senior secretary had made every effort. This could not but be gratifying, but the girl did not understand, even excluding her past, why he should burden himself with the duty of being her legal representative, and not only her patron. Dante took a firm step toward the girl and pointed to the clause in the contract, noting that that was what the loyalty clause was for. She wasn't going to betray him or run away from the castle, so there shouldn't be any problems either. All that remained was for her to sign. Still feeling a twinge of uncertainty, Ebony signed the paper with a graceful line and handed the contract to Dante, who appreciated her writing skills. They finished their work and moved on to a conversation that went on for a while. Dante sat down across from her in the chair and said that the question he would ask her was very important in determining the nature of their future relationship, so the answer needed to be clear as well. It was important for him to know what kind of person Ebony Wannick was, what she was trying to accomplish and how far she would go, as well as what was important to her. These questions stumped the girl. The Archduke was third in line to the throne just after the two current princes, sons of the monarch. His holdings and estate are the largest in all of Calcus. So why this supreme being is so interested in her aspirations, Ebony could only wonder for now. But if she felt better after answering, it wouldn't be so strange. Dante went along and suggested that the questions were too complicated for now, so he asked another about how she saw her life eventually turning out. If she was uncomfortable under the gaze of others, she could hide in a castle for the rest of her life. If she needed money, he could help her start her own business. If she wanted to study, he would send her to university. And if she wanted to start a family, he would find her the right man. If it didn't matter, then surely the girl wanted revenge. Those people who had falsely accused her of being a witch, those who had pointed fingers at her and beaten her mercilessly. Ebony clutched the skirt of her dress and asked if the Archduke would grant her this wish if she expressed herself, to which Dante, leaning toward her, replied that that was his plan, but that her word had weight here. His question was what kind of person Ebony would like to be, and she wondered. Humans could say anything they wanted in front of a higher being. Whether or not to listen to it was up to him. A man of high status no one could judge. No one would be disappointed in him. And revenge was a sweet temptation. What kind of person to be, Ebony didn't know yet, for she had no idea who she was now. However, that couldn't be the ultimate goal in life she dreamed of. She said that until recently, her only desire was to survive, no matter what the means, whether it was not to be beaten or executed. That is why she does not know how far she will go, or if she even has a chance at all. But if indeed such a thing is possible, she would like to try and make it to the end. The girl confidently stated that she has no idea where the end will be, what Your Excellency took her in for, but she still wants to go ahead and try, to be better, to grow, to be a different Ebony Wannick than the Ebony Wannick who is pointed at and told she is dirty. She wanted to be an Ebony with her head held high, one that could destroy her unhappy past. That way she could accept the world's love for her. Dante had some foreboding about her. This girl was growing, putting down roots. No matter what, this could be the beginning of a great story about a woman's growth in society. Dante laughed and noted that there was still one question left, about what was important to her. Ebony lowered her gaze and wondered if she could be important in her own right. To be the one who could help His Excellency at all costs, wouldn't think about right and wrong, wouldn't dream of reward. If only Dante would give her a chance, she was willing to do anything. Ebony declared that she was willing to put everything on the line except her own life. The Archduke laughed out loud, leaning back in his chair. He realized that the girl in front of him was even more educated than he had assumed, for her words exactly matched their new treaty. He stood up and declared with confidence that Ebony had passed. Walking up to her, He said it was his turn to answer the question about his purpose. Walking over to a stack of papers lying haphazardly on the floor, he scuffed a few sheets with the toe of his boot and began by saying that he was in Calcus doing some sort of cleanup work. No matter how much he wants to avoid it, as long as he stands as Archduke, he will only find himself embroiled in a power struggle. With that and no choice, he intends only to win. And if in the process he can clean up something he doesn't like to watch, he will. It turns out that purging involves purging people. This young, full of energy royal family member is like a gust of wind. Maybe it was more like a dry south wind now, but one day it would become a storm that would break and destroy everything in its path. The girl asked if he wished to see her as a pawn, a secret card in the game that would frighten all opponents, a dark horse, in a word, a joker. Dante answered affirmatively that he did, and offered her to be his real witch. One day, when the doctor was again making a regular examination of Ebony for the implantation of teeth, which was going quite well, Juro Vital looked into the room. He apologized for the sudden visit and introduced himself as His Excellency's secretary. The doctor invited him in as she continued her examination. The girl immediately realized that this was the man who had helped her renegotiate the terms of her contract. She introduced herself to him with a sweet smile and apologized for not being able to bow because of the corset on her back. While she greeted him, Juro looked at her appraisingly, not understanding what the Archduke found in a woman with brittle split hair and a deathly pale face without a gram of makeup that made him act. Juro covered his face in annoyance, sighing and realizing the amount of work involved began to voice the plan, even though the girls had no interest in it initially. Opening a gold pocket watch, he announced that he would call a hairdresser tomorrow morning. Before noon, they should have time to get the girls' hair in order and take measurements for sewing clothes. In the second half, for them to choose the most suitable accessories. All of the above must be accomplished in one day, and also do not wear braces when going out. Ignoring the puzzled ladies, Juro continued that they could do without makeup, as Ebony would be wearing a mask, but the manner of speech and gestures it would not hide, so the girl would have to spend time practicing. If all goes well, the plan is to find her a maid of honor as well. Ebony interrupted him, stopping him and saying she hadn't heard anything from the Archduke about it. She wanted to know what the job entailed. Of course, tidying up her appearance was important, but what the point was still unclear. Juro asked to get straight to the point, causing the girl to stammer a bit. Ebony told herself not to be nervous, for she had been told that she should not hesitate to speak her mind, at least within the walls of this castle. She looked hopefully at the secretary and asked for an explanation and more information about the job. If her role was to just sit there like a pretty doll and do nothing, she was unlikely to be able to help the Archduke in any way, and Juro understood that, but there was a certain order to everything they needed to do first. The next day, strictly on schedule, the hairdresser came and examined her damaged hair. She had to cut all of it down to her shoulders to keep it in place. With clothes too, did not do without problems, because on such a skinny body, no style would not look good. But as they say, money solves everything, so for a round sum it was fixable. After the preparations, Juro and Ebony went to the selection of jewelry and accessories. There was everything that any lady could wish for. Jewels, gloves, parasols, and the styles of dresses they were offered varied. Both the styles that among the noblewomen of Lanson were now fashionable and discussed, and the sailor style that was known in the harbor towns. Among the accessories flashed even a country-style hunting hat, which attracted special attention in society. But Juro was more selective than ever, and demanded that everything listed be excluded. The dressmaker was puzzled, for that was all they could offer at the moment, which was attracting so much attention. Then the secretary said to create new things, and to show him the catalog with all that had not yet been seen and bought, and all the designs that were available. The best option would be the styles known in Nova, Marma, and the desert. Juro instructed them to make all the hats, umbrellas, and shoes from the right catalog, and they would order the bags elsewhere. He then opened the catalog in front of the dressmaker and asked what it depicted. It turned out to be a mask, which he asked to be made as quickly and as expensively as possible. Thus, they spent their time until well into the night. The moon was already rising, and at last Ebony was able to go to her room with her secretary. Juro was about to leave her to get ready for bed, but the girl stopped him to remind him of their arrangement. Since they had done everything in his plan, she wanted to ask him what she didn't know, namely the order of things. Then Juro, sitting down across from her and taking off his glasses, agreed to talk and asked to ask one question at a time. The first thing Ebony asked was her role in the Archduke's plans. Then Juro asked if she knew anything about the Meister family and its head, the general. The girl remarked, as she sipped her tea, that she was aware of their situation in the country. It was a family that had been loyal to the ruling dynasty for generations. Juro nodded and began pouring tea for himself, telling him that in the last war, Calchas had not only lost his honor, but also a great deal of military resources, money, and soldiers, including General Meister. The circumstances were such that the general and his young wife had been unable to produce an heir, which meant that there was now no one to take over the family's estate. Moreover, the estate is home to the Meister Academy, which is the main educational institution of Calchas, the place where all knights are trained, which means whoever gets their hands on the academy will automatically gain control of the country's military power. Ebony figured out where the excitement about the acquisition of the estate came from then, so His Excellency wants Miss to take part in the battle for the estate and win it at that. Ebony is exactly who the nobles of Calchas fear the most, and yet they look down on her. The plan is for her to hide her identity and approach them, confuse them, and then take over the estate. Consequently, as the girl pointed out, the reason she has to hide is that if she comes to the auction openly, she will become a laughingstock and will not be able to participate in the race. And that mask ordered earlier should make her identity more mysterious. Juro added that she would have to pose as a foreign merchant shrouded in secrets. It will also be useful for her to mislead everyone into thinking that she is the mistress of a high-ranking figure. Ebony will wear an image gathered from various countries to hide her country of origin. Hence, the main objective is to shake up this battle as a stranger who intends to get the estate. And while everyone involved would be busy trying to find out who was behind her and track him down, they would stab him in the back. The girl, having dipped the sugar into her tea, thought a little over what had been said and declared that she was interested in one more thing, and that was whether it meant that the present owner of the estate was Lady Meister, the widow of the late general. It was indeed a temporary measure. An enigmatic slight smile stretched across Ebony's face. Bringing the hot tea to her face, she said she was asking because she didn't know the laws very well, and yet she wondered if there was a law in Calchas that forbade a woman from inheriting an estate. That sons became heirs was only a custom, but the law had never mentioned such a clause. The clock struck midnight, and at that moment the girl, as if announcing the hour of reckoning with the clinking of a cup against a saucer, voiced a most interesting reasoning. The best solution would be to let the lady get the estate, and let them take only the academy. For the aristocrats, such a development would be the most frightening and unexpected. Ebony had not slept for days because of her work, which the worried Martha could not help noticing. Without even allowing her to justify herself, the old woman began to wail about the stubbornness of Juro, the young man who had gone so far as to starve the missus. Ebony tried to say that it wasn't true as Senko picked up the conversation. Crossing his arms, he grumbled that perhaps Miss didn't know Juro well enough to realize that he was a terrible fellow. Martha chimed in and said that she had never seen such pedantic men wearing so many buttons on their clothes. They were so convincing that the girl couldn't help but wonder how bad the man under discussion could be. The only moments that came to her mind were when Juro had been attentive to her condition and reminded her to eat. And besides, it all came down to the Meister's game. In other words, the game of the Caucasian nobles, into which His Excellency the Archduke had dragged the girl without her knowledge, with the intention of mocking the high society of that country. And Juro was the one who told her everything that interested her about the situation. It was a less obligatory but kind gesture on his part. So, if he were bad, he would not do it for her comfort and awareness. Ebony found the strength to contradict the grumbling servants and say that she thought Juro was a good man. Senko and Martha roused themselves, one after the other questioning Ebony, who was squeezed on both sides, whether this crook had brainwashed their dear miss or blackmailed her. None of it was true, and the girl, naturally, denied it all. Then Martha said confidently that the manipulator could definitely use one obvious method, namely to use his handsome face, courtesy, and ability to present himself to seduce their mistress. Such a statement even made Ebony drop her fork on the table she was eating with. Martha pressed a firm hand on her mistress's chair, tilting it back, and told her to listen. She said that in this world, such suave, attractive, and intelligent men were obsessed with dirty plans, so it was best to stay away from them. Sanko, on the other hand, nodded in agreement on the sidelines. Marta continued to press on, frightening the mistress with Juro's black heart, his perfidy, something she had not encountered in all her years. Sanko confirmed this, adding that Juro had never praised his cooking, nor had he ever said a word of thanks. There was silence after that. Ebony logically assumed that His Excellency's personality was not so good either, which Marta confirmed without hesitation. Sanko shuddered at her answer and tried to say something, but the old woman was unstoppable. She told him that the gentleman was just as wicked, and that it was true. It's been over a decade since she first met him, and she still doesn't know what he's thinking. She'd originally thought he was a monster, popping up in the east and west, pacing back and forth, appearing and disappearing without a word. But what annoyed her the most was that he showed up at the exact moment she was talking bad about him. As luck would have it, Dante was standing right behind her. He put a hand on the perky old woman's shoulder and said wryly that he would take her words under advisement. Marta was startled, exclaiming in surprise, and Sanko rushed away to his workstation as if he hadn't been involved in the conversation. Marta stood shuddering and tried to excuse herself, but the gentleman was already preoccupied with his guest. He walked up behind her and stabbed a fork that the girl had dropped recently, a leftover sausage from her plate, and brought it to her mouth, asking if she had been busy lately. Ebony watched with annoyance at the eating of her leftover treat, and exhaling, replied that it was true, but that was okay. After pausing to chew on everything, Dante stated that his secretary disliked Ebony, which was why he was acting this way. When Dante became the girl's patron, Juro dared to voice his disagreement right to his face. Because the secretary is not very nice, but he is still a sincere person, so it would be nice to get along with him. Ebony noticed that His Excellency was worried about her, thinking that she might get hurt. But, contrary to expectation, she was perfectly well, for she had never thought that every man in this castle would trust her. And above all, she said that she was grateful to Juro for his help and thought him a very intelligent man. Dante offered with a smile to tell Juro in person. Compliments were usually said in person, but behind his back they were just bone-washing. It was an indirect jab at the old woman who was still standing behind him. But then the man remembered that he had come to the girl for a reason, and offered to take her out to the backyard after the meal to show her something important, though perhaps tedious, hoping that the girl knew how to ride. Benjamin was waiting for them in the backyard, holding the reins of a magnificent white horse with a golden mane. It turned out that Ebony didn't know how to ride, for it was forbidden to teach even that to women in Calcasieu. In protest of this, he told the girl to learn it after her recovery, but for now they would ride together. The man deftly jumped onto the horse and reached out to Ebony, lifting her easily by the waist to his side, telling her to sit still so she wouldn't fall and hurt herself. She complied embarrassedly, and the two rode away through the night forests. At last, they reached a place where the horses could not pass, so they dismounted and walked on their own. It wasn't much longer, and just over the hill was what Dante wanted to show Ebony. He helped her down and led her by the hand to the right place. When they reached the end of the road, the girl froze, unable to believe her eyes. The view of Spate Prison opened up before them. Spate Prison, located on the outskirts of the capital city of Lanson, is the only women's prison in Calcas, the place where all the witches of the current era are gathered. It was here that Ebony Wannock served her sentence for 5 years, awaiting the execution of her death sentence. And while execution is a legal punishment, many people in the country have called for its abolition, so the sentences have not actually been carried out. For the past few days, however, smoke had been billowing over Spite Prison. Ebony had unmistakably identified it as coming from the crematorium. Ebony said that there were days, of course, when the bodies were disposed of, but those of prisoners who were debilitated by disease or who couldn't take the hard labor and beatings. But what was strangest of all was that the crematorium never operated at night as it did now. Dante had picked up on the fact that reports said it had all started 3 days ago. 2 months had passed since Ebony Wannick had been released and sent to the Archduke's castle. The prison staff had had plenty of time to listen to everyone's opinions and expedite the delayed executions to prevent similar precedents. Ebony was well aware that her release was to blame for everything. People are afraid, and so does knowledge. But she had been released, despite her horrible crimes, and if the same thing happened again to other prisoners, they would be plotted and retaliated against. But there was something that worried Ebony just as much. She reached out to the walls of the hated prison, remembering her friends. On the day when Ebony had 1 foot free, the girls rejoiced heartily at her pardon, congratulated her, and held her hand tenderly through the bars. Ebony had thought she would end her days as a maid on some nobleman's estate, and then it would not be much different from life in prison. But since she had been released by the queen herself, it was unlikely that Ebony would end so sadly. Sasha, the hopeful one who urged her to survive at all costs, Beatrice, the perky girl who wanted Ebony to stay alive for them too, and Monica, the light-hearted one who told her not to give up or turn back. All these girls, her friends, knew and said that as long as Ebony was alive, she could do whatever she wanted. Shrinking from the cold and hugging herself, the girl stared at the walls, remembering the faces of her friends. To Dante's surprise, she didn't shed a single tear. The reason was a good one. Miss had promised herself not to cry, not to live in regret, and not to be trapped in the past. The moment she walked out the door, she resolved to forget everything that had happened within those horribly oppressive walls. They agreed with their friends that they would beg for pity after death when they met the deity. But while they were alive, they would not pity each other. Ebony declared that she knew why His Excellency had brought her here. He feared her resolve would weaken, and her assumption was true. From now on, the enemies she would have to face were a staple of society, and a legitimized inequality that had been passed down from generation to generation in this state. Dante feared that Ebony's resolve might waver when she had to face the entire country. But it was presumptuous of him to worry about that. Ebony turned to her lord and asked not to worry, for she had already decided that she would fight, would have no fear, no regrets, and would be his trump card no matter what. Her gaze now was one that would surely suit the goddess of night and death, determined and cold. Dante took the girl's hands and noticed how cold they were. Warming them, he stated that he did not pity her, realizing that he might offend her. The girl would have to hold the spear in those gentle hands, and the night domain would belong to this ruthless, overbearing goddess. As dawn broke, they made their way back to the castle. Juro greeted them at the entrance, bowing his head. This was the end of preparations for the debut of the ruthless and unstoppable Lady Ebony Wannick. All that remained was for the performance to begin. Upon his return, Dante, checking his papers, asked Juro how Ebony was doing. The secretary replied that, given her long time in prison, he thought she wouldn't be able to adjust to current social trends and etiquette. But it turned out to be exactly the opposite. Several times each day, Ebony came to Juro with visible interest in one book or another, and many questions about what she had read to better understand the details. Barring the first few days when she was shy of him, her strong desire to learn surprised Juro. In addition, recalling her judgment during the discussion of her role, the secretary concluded that she was an intelligent and educated person. He remembered well the first time he'd seen her. The hunched shoulders, the lost blank stare, and the ashy pallor of her skin. He had thought her a disposable pawn in His Excellency's plans, but her eyes, with their strange glow like a night beast's, told him that she was the dark horse on the stage. Juro had told him of Ebony's plan to make Lady Meister heir to the manor, and Dante wondered why she'd decided that way. The arguments were very valid. His Excellency already controlled the largest territory in Calcasieu. Needless to say, he was also in line for the throne, and if he got General Meister's estate, the people in power would not leave him alone. Juro remembered her desire, the desperation, obsession, and rage that palpably lived in her heart. He added from her words that although she had agreed to be His Excellency's chess piece, she should not be a threat to him. Dante's response pleased him, but Juro bluntly stated that he still did not like the woman. After the conversation, he walked down to the carriage outside and met Ebony already ready for introduction. She was wearing a gorgeous red dress, a combination of different styles and accessories from different countries. She wore a raven mask on her face, adding to the look of irresistibility and mystery. Juro said he would accompany Ebony straight to the Maester's residence, and on the way they would meet the first platoon of His Excellency's guard. Juro admitted that he had been too hasty in judging her only as a disposable pawn, because those who have nothing to lose have no reason to give up. After waiting for the girl to climb into the carriage and getting in with her, they set off. His Excellency had no intention of coming, which surprised Ebony. But Juro, after a pause, as if speaking with annoyance to himself, said that the master believed in her submission and loyalty. The girl felt the responsibility on her shoulders. This was the man who had given her a new life and assured her that imagining a desired future was perfectly normal. She was determined to repay his kindness. Juro repeated for the last time the details of what needed to be figured out at the event. Everything had been thought out for her legend. Her name is Raven, which translates to raven. She is a wealthy and carefree woman who wore a raven mask, matching her name, and a broker who earns commissions in various countries. Also, according to legend, she was hired by a higher-ranking person whose identity should never be revealed. The reason she joined the Maester's games is only because she will earn a nice commission. On background and family, one should answer inconsistently, vaguely, and inaccurately. But if anyone doubts her abilities, she should loudly demand that they point out the person who helped the mob get their hands on the Crimson Hall in the Odium Desert. Ebony then asked what should be done when she met with Lady Meister. The answer was ambiguous. Juro said she should try to piss her off by saying that although she was a woman who had failed to produce an heir, she could not so easily give her late husband's legacy to strangers. Ebony flicked her fan and realized that he wanted the lady to join the battle for the estate as well. Juro added that as long as she behaved on equal footing with the lady as they practiced, there should be no problem. The coachman at this moment gave notice that he could see the carriage of their guards. Pulling his hat over his face, Juro complimented Ebony on her naturalness. The girl smiled and thanked him, stepping out of the carriage and leaving him there. Ebony made her way with the guards towards the manor while one of the military men paid attention to her, offering to carry such a heavy mask for her, for which he received an umbrella on his back. The perky miss, getting into character, said she would not walk next to someone who smelled so strongly of booze. The guards laughed, encouraging the girl and saying that she was absolutely right. As they approached the gate, they stopped. The butler greeting them asked for a name. Ebony cheered herself up with the thought that she could do it, because the Archduke believed in her. With her fan spread spectacularly, she identified herself as Raven and asked him to tell her that a crow had flown in from afar to see the glint of gold. Ebony was escorted as far as Madame Meister's room. The door creaked open, and a lovely lady in black mourning clothes appeared, who curtsied to greet her foreign guest. Behind her stood an old lady, the maid on the estate. That's right. The late general's wife was standing before her, a target she must provoke into active action. The widow introduced herself as Jillian Meister and suggested that the journey for Raven had been rather long and arduous. Ebony, turning her head as she surveyed the estate, stated that the journey had not been so long and got straight to the point, noting that the residence was as small as the palm of her hand. Jillian shuddered as she listened to the guest's speech, declaring that she could run from the main gate straight into the drawing room, but she made no reply to this, and asked Nanny, the old lady, to fetch tea for the guest. Raven flopped onto the couch, spreading her skirt and exposing her shapely legs, exclaiming how impressed she was with the general's modesty. It was the first time she had ever seen such simple furnishings in such an important place. Jillian frowned. The attire, the demeanor, the blatantly made-up name, everything about this woman in front of her said that she had clearly come here not to pay her respects, but to profit. Questions flashed through the widow's mind as to who had sent her and for what purpose. Ebony continued to play her part. Leaning back against the couch, she called out to the nanny who had come in with tea, asking her vulgar question about why she was working so hard at an age when she should be retiring and returning to her hometown to see her grandchildren. Speaking of the staff, she also suggested that there should have been more male servants, suggesting that the general had been neglectful of domestic duties because he was busy running the academy. In that case, she caustically suggested. His leaving wasn't so bad. The nanny objected, but the patient widow calmed the nanny down, discounting her guest's foreign origin. At that moment, Jillian flinched at the direct question about her age. Besides, Raven had addressed her by her first name, which was unacceptable when it came to an unfamiliar married lady who should be addressed by her last name. After hesitantly answering that she was 34 and the general was 55 when he left them, she was embarrassed by Raven's statement that their difference was comparable to the ages of a daughter and father. With a bright smile on her face, Raven continued to ask uncomfortable questions. This time she asked what kind of wife she was, which she almost got from the furious nanny. Jillian subdued the nanny this time too, though she realized that her guest was overstepping her bounds. Dress and accessories were not insignificant trifles. This woman was unusual, and she spoke the official language equally well with the men. Jillian answered, though she didn't understand why the guest was interested, that she was the second wife, and the first had left home of her own accord, unable to bear a child even after 10 years of life together. Pointing a finger at the widow, Raven exclaimed that it was a perfect coincidence that Jillian could put the estate up for sale right now and use the proceeds to leave the country. She gave 2 thumbs up and said that she would pay twice as much as anyone else was offering, and the widow was still young and healthy, so she would have time to remarry and get pregnant. Jillian replied with embarrassment that the customs in this country were not quite so simple. Perhaps Raven was unaware because of her foreign background, but terrible things happen to widows who have been caught up in scandal. Bowing her head and interlacing her fingers with each other, Jillian muttered that they could be whipped, imprisoned. It was not out of the question that they could be sent to the other side of the world by the assembled family or remarried. With a shudder in her voice, Lady Meister asked who Raven was to be so careless as to say such things to her. Ebony, however, deftly diverted the subject, pointing out that the widow was exaggerating and urging her to be honest with herself. She asked if Jillian had ever dreamed of anything, citing the beautiful city of Nova on the river, the magnificent theater at Marm, the beautiful nights of Babylon, and the sensuous bodies of soldiers in the desert. Jillian was slowly starting to lose her temper, and that was just what was needed. Raven went on serenely that Babylon was ruled by a queen, a woman who had no husband or children, and in Nova you could make up a family name, give birth to a daughter, and let her inherit it. In the desert, however, a woman is certainly in the arms of one man, but in the event of his death, one can find a stronger one. Having stated that, Raven laughed resoundingly. Jillian jumped up from her seat, urging her to listen, but Ebony continued her monologue as if ignoring the widow. She said that being alone wasn't so bad if you had money, for then you could pick a man abroad like a wild horse. Horrified, Jillian concluded that Raven had come to tarnish her honor. The widow began to ask who she was, and on whose orders she had come here. Lady Meister had already gone through all the options in her family. The men who'd told her to sell the estate through the courts, since she had no experience in managing it, to leave the probate business alone. Or maybe it was just those who were eager to cash in on the estate, offering to auction it off and get the cash on which the lady would then live and support herself. Raven replied that she was not, but the widow was ready to send her out the door, exclaiming that her husband was the greatest general this nation had ever seen, a true patriot, not like all the rats that had fled here. But the question from Raven about whether she had been abandoned put Jillian on edge, for even His Majesty could not defend this estate. And since that was the case, why the widow was so sure that these hyenas would let her keep her honor, eat well, and just live peacefully remained unclear. Raven argued that all those rats could easily start an idle rumor about Lady Meister with some unknown man. Silence fell, and with a dead stare, the widow asked Nanny to leave them alone. As soon as the door clicked open, an enraged Jillian flew up to Ebony, pinning her to the sofa and grabbing her by the shoulders. The widow looked at her guest with tears in her eyes, whether from grief or anger. She declared that if these people dared to tarnish her honor, she would hang herself before her husband's grave and become a vengeful spirit that would curse them all. But Raven calmly remarked that in such a case the estate would still be in the wrong hands, and her honor would not be safe. Removing her hands from her shoulders, Ebony stated that the men had already come up with a name for all this fun. The Meister Games, that was what they called what was so important to Jillian, but was only a game to them where the winner would get the estate. Lady Meister cried with hopelessness, not knowing what to do and angry at all these people. Raven took the widow by the chin and looked into her eyes, reassuring her that her employer was not so shameless. He had supposedly told her that he would rather purchase the estate himself than give it to those rats. But he had not said that the estate should be taken from the widow. Ebony whispered in her ear that there were no rules to this game, and no laws in the land forbidding her own participation. And this was a good chance to keep everything from being confiscated. So Jillian has only 3 choices: leave the estate and flee, end up on the street with a tarnished honor after the scandal, or take over the estate herself. Like a predator, Raven walked around Jillian, listing the options and tempting her, telling her that all these people wanted to seize what was rightfully hers, the wife to whom the late general had left the estate. The widow understood what the guest was trying to accomplish, but she also realized that there was nothing wrong with what she was saying. When she looked in the mirror, it was as if she saw her inner self, which was telling her that she did not want to give the estate to anyone at all. At that moment, a black business card with the image of a raven appeared in front of her face. Ebony, holding out the card with graceful, slender fingers, said the widow only needed to choose the right side. Asking to be contacted at the address on the card as soon as Jillian made a decision, she pulled away and headed for the exit. Stopping at the door, she glanced at the widow again, adding that her secretary worked at the Caboose Casino and she only needed to ask for a man named Jackson. The door slammed shut, and behind it, the mysterious lady disappeared, leaving behind no clear things, only riddles and uncertainties. Jillian stared at the closed door, matching the puzzle in her head about the same raven, the raven that had flown in from afar to the glint of gold. Ebony had finally left the walls of the Meister manor, and a guard was waiting at the gate. As the girl was escorted to the carriage, she pondered whether she had done well, going over all the possibilities of events in her head. A prudent Lady Meister would never show up at a place like the casino that was famous for being a den of men just to find Raven, for that would create rumors, which was what she feared most. The purpose of today's meeting was to show that the widow had another opportunity which she could seize. Ebony, climbing into the carriage, felt the tension that had built up in her from these thoughts and excitement, a dizziness that almost knocked her off her feet. In the carriage, she was saved from falling by the Archduke himself, who was awaiting her return. He put his finger to his lips to keep her quiet and not give him away, and sat her down on the seat. Ebony asked why he had come all this way, to which she received a joking reply from Dante, who thought the miss had missed him and had decided to brighten her day. But what he really wanted was for the girl to give an account of the work done. Then Ebony told him that although the owner of the estate was very famous, the residence was surprisingly small, and there were very few servants, and the widowed Jillian was cared for only by an elderly nanny. Dante explained that the men of Lady Meister's family wanted to bite her like rabid dogs, so Jillian was, in a sense, protecting herself, since there might be many spies among the servants. Ebony continued her tale of how Jillian had listened attentively to her in spite of her suspicions, and Ebony had made her boil with anger as she had been commanded. Scenes replayed in her mind of how the enraged widow had wanted to chase her away and cried in anger. But Raven then, still smiling, had whispered to her at the end that there was no law in Caucasus forbidding women from being heiresses. Dante smiled contentedly and leaned back in his seat, and Ebony, removing her mask, asked what would happen if she made a mistake somewhere. But the Archduke countered that there had been no mistake. Turning back to the window, he said he would reward the girl on her return to the castle. The carriage was just pulling up to its destination, and Dante dragged the girl by the arm in the right direction. Ebony stammered that she had done nothing worthy of reward, which, as the Archduke noted, was exactly as Juro had said. As His Excellency pondered what to do to please the miss, the secretary muttered something about work that had just begun, for which there was no reward. Ebony said that made perfect sense, to which Dante, exhaling, replied that Miss didn't pay attention to such things, and yes, she was the first person to protest when it came to the award. But even despite that reaction, he hoped she would like the surprise. They walked right up to the entrance of the stables. Ebony looked around and saw many horses in their stalls, looking at them. When she heard Dante's voice calling her, She looked in his direction and saw before her a magnificent black horse with a snow-white mane. The Archduke said proudly, holding the reins, that it was payment in advance for work done. Their past ride on horseback was not very comfortable. It was much better to ride by himself and control the animal by himself. The girl sighed in amazement and reached out her hand to the massive muzzle of the horse. Touching it, she remembered how, as a child, her nanny had forbidden her even to touch these noble animals on the orders of her master, who, learning that she had disobeyed, had banned her from the cellar again. Little Ebony thought that if she got her own horse, she could do whatever she wanted with it. But even so, it was a problem. Nanny said that the noble ladies would laugh at her if they heard about her hobby, because, as it is believed in their country, riding is a purely masculine occupation. The fact is that if a woman holds the reins, she releases corrupt energy, which causes the owner distress on the road. But the nanny reassured the girl, assuring her that one day she would be able to ride a horse, but only while nestled in the arms of her future husband. But such an answer would never satisfy little Vonique. Ebony put her arms around the horse's neck, clinging to him with joy and happiness. The animal bowed its head to her obediently, which was surprising, for Benjamin had recently warned Dante of the horse's violent temperament. The girl thanked His Excellency with a broad smile, and the Archduke said that from now on, this best horse would be her legs and support. Dante added that this animal is amazing, so it's worth trying to be owned by an owner that won't disappoint him, such as the Queen of Babylon, to be able to ride him. Ebony gave the horse the name Raven, the same as the heroine's name, which led her to meet the animal. Dante said it wasn't a gift, but a reward, for he was sure Ebony wouldn't let him down until the very end. Soon she would have a job to back up her words with. That job is that the previously played Mrs. Raven must visit one place this coming weekend, namely the home of Marcus Sadel, the social club run by the short man. A few days after the visit to Lady Meister's estate came Saturday, the day on which the second act of the play, the infiltration of Marcus Sadel's house, must be performed. Today, Miss must dress in the fashion of Nova. Juro presented her with a dark blue gown with gold inlays. It was special in that the top was separate from the skirt, as the women of Nova are active in social events and need outfits that are easy to move in, just like the men of Calcas. Juro, while helping Ebony get dressed, also explained that such ladies were interested in physical activity, such as horseback riding, just like Miss herself. Ebony thought that even though the mask was just a fragile trinket, she was surprisingly filled with the feeling that she might be someone she wanted to be. As she put it on, Ebony thought that even though the mask was just a fragile trinket, putting it on made her feel like she could be anything she wanted to be. She is Raven now, a raven flown in for a glint of gold, a mysterious woman working for His Excellency and the Joker in this game. It's as if she's like a shadowy mist personality that only comes out into the light at the necessary hour. Adjusting the hat on Ebony's head, Juro briefly outlined what needed to be done for today. He noted that His Excellency would also participate, but would join later, and the girl's task was to enter the club and stay there until midnight. This time, her partner will be a nobleman from Nova, the jeweler Vicomte Pierre, who only knows that she is a broker working in Calcassus. Hence today Ebony would have to fool two parties, Marcus Sadel with all the nobles of Calcas and Viscount Pierre himself. Otherwise, as Ebony paraphrased, find out the reason for the visit of the jeweler from Nova to Calcas and find out what Marcus Sadel is doing with Jillian Meister. Juro nodded and wished her luck once again. The girls set off alone toward the club. Upon arrival, her coachman Jackson stopped by, announcing with a smile that they had arrived at the rendezvous. Ebony smelled that he smelled of alcohol again, even in the workplace, to which the man firmly replied that beer was not alcohol at all. Of course, he got a slap on the back for making such a statement, this time with a cane. In the distance, a man appeared who clearly stood out from the crowd. Yes, it was definitely Viscount Pierre of Nova. They greeted each other in the official continental language, and Raven held out her hand in a greeting that was clearly not customary in such circles. The Viscount was somewhat taken aback, but shook the girl's hand with a smile, remarking that she was an interesting person, and his employer had not mentioned that he would meet such an eccentric broker. Raven assumed that was unusual for him, and realized that no one had warned her that the jeweler had his own employer, so she should take a closer look at him. With a smile, she invited him into her carriage, warning him that the coachman was an alcoholic, but a master of his craft and would not go astray. It was nearing evening, and they had arrived at the right place. There were already a lot of people around, mostly men, chatting about their topics. The work was behind them, and only fun awaited them ahead, which was not surprising. Among the many properties inherited by the Marquis Marcus Sadel, the most valuable was believed to be this social club, located on the main street of Lanson. It is a 3-story establishment, a place for men's recreation, to which the passage for women is closed. The only exceptions were those with a special status. In other words, girls for fun and atmosphere with continuation. Ebony did not even want to guess what kind of debauchery was going on within the walls of this club. The men were proud to visit this place, but the noble women would only be shamed if anyone saw them in this place. They approached the entrance where they were greeted by a man who clarified if Raven was a woman, to which she wryly asked the counter-question if she looked so much like a man. The man said that unfortunately the entrance was closed to women. A rumbling sound was heard. It was people paying attention to what was happening. The Viscount asked what the man had said, not understanding the local language, to which Raven replied that the beautiful custom of Calcas did not allow her to go there only because she was a woman. The jeweler said thoughtfully that this put him in a difficult position, for he could not conduct business without an intermediary. After all, it was a matter of trust. Raven declared loudly for all around to hear that this was no mere affair, but a bargain worth 1,000,000 gold pieces. She pointed her finger at the man at the door, exclaiming that her partner was the richest man in Nova, Viscount Pierre, willing to buy an expensive jewel to help this poor, war-losing country, and the man was getting in the way of an important mediator. The people around him whispered. The sum was not insignificant, and it was a huge mistake on the part of the greeter. But the man was adamant, stating that the main rule of this establishment forbade the entrance of women of individual status. Naturally, he meant that she had to be either a mistress or the girl of easy virtue whom the Vicomte had brought in order to pass. One could pretend to be one, but that would mean that she would not be able to be a mediator and work on an equal footing with the Viscount. It might lead to skepticism from the jeweler, but if she ventured to pursue it, she might expose her identity. Ebony felt a lump in her throat at the agony of the choice. She had promised not to let His Excellency down, so she frantically chose the right path. Shortly before this predicament, Juro and Dante met exactly as planned in front of the Foreign Ministry building in Calcassus, thinking he was probably late since his secretary was already waiting for him there. But everything was right on time. They settled into the carriage to head to the club. Dante began to ask how the first part of the plan was going, to which Juro replied that based on Jackson's report, Viscount Pierre Ebony liked her very much. He had been very polite to her at first, and after she had informed him of the ongoing mining operations in Calcasieu, he had trusted Raven completely. So much so that he even stated that he would give her a little support in gambling. Dante grinned, asking if Ebony even knew the rules of such games, but the prudent Juro said he'd shown her a few moves beforehand in case they came in handy. It was hard for the Archduke to imagine such an act. In his mind, it looked more like a child who had just learned the names of the cards trying to play the role of an adult gambler. But what was really interesting to him was that the presented, fictionalized image of Raven suited her so well. Juro's pocket watch clicked, and he glanced at it, asking the coachman to speed up. Dante was surprised, for they weren't late at all. Then the secretary admitted that Raven had been denied entry to the club. Juro had just left to pick up her master, just as she was beginning to have a heated argument with whoever was greeting the guests at the entrance. This was disastrously ruining the whole plan. At this point, Dante immediately ordered the carriage to turn around and head for the red light district as quickly as possible. Juro didn't understand his master's intentions, for they had just arrived at the club. Dante knew that Ebony had been denied entry only because she was a woman. The jackals that dwell in this filthy place are only interested in filling their mouths with gold, and in protecting a place that has been dubbed a place for men only, naively believing that no one knows of the debauchery that goes on behind its walls. The secretary was about to say the worst of it, that they would have to let the Viscount go in there alone, but Dante interrupted him by raising his hand at him and saying that they had a duty to show all these people how great the Archduke's influence was in this country. He couldn't be the knight on the white horse that would save his subordinate going through a difficult moment, but he could appear as the scoundrel who would cover her with a cloak. Ebony was really in the throes of thought at this point. Her thoughts were distracted by the rumbling that was going on all around the square near the building. She didn't know what she should do, even unwittingly began to act like Ebony. And if she didn't wake up, the mask would slip and the plan would be over. She squeezed the dress and asked herself how Raven would have acted in this situation. Right. She wouldn't even have to make an effort. She wouldn't be embarrassed by anything. She would have just smiled, like a predator who was unfamiliar with the word defeat. Just like the Archduke himself, cold and thoughtful. In a moment, the girl laughed out loud, looking up at the man who had so stubbornly refused to let her in and exclaiming that she had known it would turn out this way. She grabbed him by the collar and asked him threateningly if he could pay her back for the insult. Though the man tried to answer her that the girl would make things so difficult, she looked at him with a bloodthirsty glint in her eyes and continued to ask uncomfortable questions about whether he had any idea what would happen if he made her uncomfortable. Just at that moment, the crowd around them stirred. Everyone around them stared toward the road, not believing their eyes. There appeared several large ornate carriages, from which a crowd of beauties appeared, laughing loudly and glowing with merriment. They all went straight to the entrance, exclaiming that they were dancers from Sabrina's establishment, and that 12 of them were Lanson's free mistresses. A man in the crowd resented their presence, but one of the ladies serenely replied that they had come here by invitation, and her words were taken up by another girl, assuring her that they were with a very, very honorable companion. The ladies turned around, pointing toward the carriage with their hands. Velia bowed to him. The passage was cleared for a man of a slightly shabby appearance, who came out accompanied by 2 ladies, who, laughing, embraced him and walked beside him. It was His Excellency, the Archduke Dante Bord Schneider himself. The men lined up, haphazardly removing their hats and bowing, wondering how the Archduke himself had honored them enough to come here. The girls who accompanied Dante giggled and asked if the men were greeting them too. As they approached the entrance, His Excellency asked the reason why the girls were still not inside. Ebony could smell the alcohol on the gentleman's breath and covered her nose with her hand. The girls, showering the man at the entrance with attention and embarrassment, began to lament that they had not been given an open door even after they said they were His Excellency's companions, and they couldn't go back to their store. Then Dante leaned over to the greeter and said they had an invitation, and this whole situation was going nowhere. Looking at him coldly, Dante ordered him to get out of the way and open the doors immediately. The intimidated man had no choice but to obey him, and he promptly opened the doors in front of them. In a flash, the entire crowd of beautiful maidens, led by the Archduke, poured into the club, accompanying him joyfully and unconcernedly. At one point, Dante turned and whispered to Ebony that the outfit suited her. That was when she realized that the smell of alcohol wasn't from his drinking. Dante was completely sober, and the whole act had been an emergency part of the plan. The Viscount adjusted his clothes and motioned that it was her and Raven's chance to get in too. She agreed and walked forward with the jeweler, not believing the Archduke had gone that far for her alone. It was pure truth. When they arrived in the red light district, Dante was determined, though Juro doubted the need to do such a thing. They had shown up at the house with the girls for rent with a whole bag of gold, not even counting coins. But it was clear that there was so much money that it should be enough to cover the daily income of the whole place on Fish Day. The secretary covered his face in embarrassment so as not to look at the girls, and Dante, stripping off his outer garments and throwing off his tie so that his shirt looked ragged, began to dispense instructions. He told them to round up all the available hostesses in the neighborhood without exception, and to bring him expensive alcohol and perfume and douse him, but not too much. Giving himself a vulgar appearance, he described what he expected from the girls. They are to accompany him, pretending to entertain him, and to create as much noise as possible inside the halls. Other than that, they are entirely their own. If the operation was successful, Dante promised to reward them all from above. The main thing was diligence, because a perfect one-man stage was needed. Well, the plan was working. Yes, so much so that Raven had no trouble getting in. She grabbed a vocalized wine from the waiter, blending in with her surroundings. The jeweler excitedly asked if it was the Archduke, saying he had an amazing aura. The girl confirmed that he looked more rugged than the rumors said. One of the guests approached them, asking if Raven's presence here was special. He noticed the two of them still outside, expressing delight at their presence. To think, a man with 1 million gold from Nova and a lady wearing a mask. With a smile, the Viscount countered that his mediator was first and foremost a person. The guest was surprised at such words, for the girl was too young to be entrusted with such a sum. He assumed it was only because of her beauty. Raven chuckled at his remarks, noting that he couldn't draw such conclusions without knowing what she really looked like. Having heard her guest with those words, she sipped her wine and added that she was not interested in how unique he was, for he was no match for Viscount Pierre. Another man joined their conversation, noting the accuracy of Raven's words and asking for more details, for he was still outside interested in their business talk. Then the lady told him that the largest mountain range was between Babylon and Kalkas. It is there that both countries mine the best minerals and gems on the continent. The man crossed his arms, wryly noting that even children knew that. Raven, not confused, suggested with a smile that he probably also knew that Kalkas, compared to Babylon, lacked jewelry. She asked the man to remember the voiced thought that the people of Babylon were more skilled in jewelry making, and continued her story. She pointed out that while Kalkas was becoming known for its military might, making great strides in metalworking and the manufacture of weapons and ammunition, the jewelry industry had not developed at all. She then suggested that the gemstones from the Kalkas Mountains should earn a glittering reputation on the continent. There was an uproar. People began to discuss the words of the mysterious girl, who kept talking about the end of the 7-year war with Babylon and the time that would be freed up to devote to development in the field of minerals and stones. For now, the war for jewels had already begun. She pointed confidently at the Viscount, claiming he was here because he believed in Kalkas as much as she did. The jeweler embarrassingly admitted that he owned the most famous workshop in Nova and promised to provide labor in exchange for a supply of gems. Then, theatrically turning around and addressing the guests, Raven called to show Kalkas's ambition compared to other countries by making a deal with the Viscount. The men on the sidelines marveled at the way she spoke, but the only thing that stopped them was that Raven was a girl. She interrupted them, not thinking long enough to notice that they were eye to eye with her employer. The lady skillfully turned the situation to her own side, saying that she wore the mask only because this man also considered her unreliable because she was female. One of the men laughed, picking up on her employer's cleverness, while the other realized the girl was being sarcastic. Nevertheless, the situation was already in Raven's hands and had attracted many eyes and ears. She stated that if she succeeded in today's deal, she would be able to remove the mask and show the world her true face. So if those around her were curious as to what she looked like, let them provide the Viscount with references. Suddenly, a certain man approached and clinked a vocalized wine with Raven, expressing his curiosity about the face behind the girl's mask. Ebony froze for a moment, recognizing Marcus Sadel himself in front of her. He stated that coincidentally, he just happened to have valuable information with interesting details. At that moment, his gaze traveled to the table where the guests were gambling. Then Marcus offered to make an outrageous wager. If Raven won, he promised to help her contact the most reliable mine in Kalkassia. But if he won, the girl would have to throw off everything else she was wearing, right here. There was noise and laughter all around, putting both Raven and Viscount in a humiliating position. It seemed to be Marcus's favorite move. Even though the man was cunning and vulgar, Ebony agreed to this absurd deal. Marcus liked the mysterious stranger's answer, and, placing his wineglass on the waiter's tray, he explained the rules of the game. He suggested that they be simplified, simpler than the traditional dice game. Both sides would get 5 dice in a cup, and the one with the highest score after the roll would win. Raven incredulously asked how she could be sure there wasn't a catch, to which Marcus assured her that he wasn't that short-sighted, and if a scuffle like this suddenly came up, this club would be shut down immediately, which he could personally vouch for. The Viscount tried to quiet his mediator, saying that she should not go so far, but the girl was determined. Holding out her glass to the worried jeweler, she proposed to start now and to finish in 1 round. Marcus was amazed and of course agreed, though asking if it would be okay. Raven rightly pointed out that if they dragged out the game, They would tire and the fun would be over. In fact, she had already calculated all the outcomes of events already, and even if she lost, she would endure insults like this. But there was no way that was going to happen. Marcus laughed, calling the girl a fire-like lady, and already wanted to see a heated spectacle befitting her personality. Two stood at arm's length with their hands on their cups. At the croupier's command, they began shaking their containers of dice. Raven was more excited than ever, but she felt invisible support from where her master sat, watching. It was as if she could ghostly feel his hand on hers. It was an unforgettable feeling that could not be compared to anything else. A feeling that if she agreed to this bet, she would win it. The players stopped on command and showed their dice. The crowd around them gasped when they saw that Marcus's dice showed completely different values, while Raven's were 6 without exception. After the game, Marcus laughingly remarked that Viscount had a very versatile broker with an unexpected talent for gambling. He hadn't experienced such a crushing defeat in a long time. The jeweler confirmed this with a smile, saying that his eyes were always drawn to sparkling personalities like Raven due to his work with jewelry. After looking at the wine in his glass, the jeweler brought it to his mouth, saying in between that he had heard of 2 exceptional gems in the royal family of this country. Though it wasn't entirely unambiguous, the Viscount was talking about princes. Marcus noted that the jeweler was absolutely right, but there was one thing worth noting, and that was their number of not their 2 but 3 people, and each of them is as outstanding as possible. Now, as the Vicomte had said, he was looking forward to meeting the personage who would be introduced to him by such a highly intelligent man as the Marquis. While they were talking about their business, Ebony unwittingly overheard a conversation between 2 men nearby. One of them said that the Marquis of Sadel must be nervous, but retained his cunning charm, and also asked his interlocutor if he had seen what had happened before, for the Marquis's secretary had also been busy lately. His companion put his finger to his lips, suggesting that this conversation was not for a public place, so he nodded toward the balcony and, using that as an excuse to leave, asked if he had a cigar. Ebony immediately realized that she might learn valuable information. The Vicomte's attention was focused on Sadel now, and if she stepped away for a minute, it wouldn't be a problem. Since one of the men had said something about cigars, it meant they'd be out on the terrace. And to listen, she'd have to get there before they did. And while the men were looking for someone to borrow matches from, Ebony walked straight to the balcony like a shadow. Well, it wasn't hard to get in, but it was harder to get out. There was nothing but a couch in the middle, and it would be naive to hide behind a curtain. As luck would have it, one of the ladies happened to have matches, and the men were already walking onto the balcony, ready to talk. Reluctantly smoking, they didn't seem to notice the girl anywhere and decided to continue their interrupted conversation. Then the man who had started it all went on to tell about the Marquis of Sadel's secretary, who kept talking to some fellow before, the one who was of the knights the late general had raised. That guy had been suspended due to losing an arm in the war. The second man even remembered his last name. It was the first son of House Trail. And yet the listener did not understand the connection between these details, for these families were of quite different ranks. This was most suspicious. As he exhaled his cigarette smoke, the knowledgeable man remarked that even Archduke Schneider had come to his rival's club today and had made a fuss. His interlocutor realized what his informant was getting at. It was an indirect declaration of war to tickle the nerves of the Marquis of Sadel. The man continued to spread rumors that Meister's widow refused to cede the estate and still held it in her hands. So Marcus is backed into a corner, so he resorts to such a reckless method to take out the widow. It was all in the palm of my hand. The scandal that erupted around the knight, who was a rising star, but stumbled and became disabled, and the young widow, who was the wife of his late teacher. Such stories are ubiquitous, so no one will doubt their veracity. The interlocutor, smoking, was indignant at how Trial could agree to this, and was about to add something when he heard a rustle from somewhere below and turned his attention to him. Asking his informant if he heard anything, he got only 2 guesses in response. Either he was drunk or it was a rat. But the rat was Ebony, hiding under the sofa. The day after the event, a joyful Ebony went straight to the Archduke's office, apologizing for entering without permission, for he had ordered her to report on her work as soon as she returned. His Excellency seemed to have had a little too much alcohol last night, so he was resting with a book on his face. Picking it up, he looked at Ebony with a smile and expressed his joy at seeing her. She looked, in his opinion, quite chipper today, perhaps positively influenced by last night's party. Ebony, keeping up the intrigue, said that the gentleman would be surprised to hear this. Dante gestured for her to sit down at the table with all the goodies and tea so that she could tell him more about it. The girl sat down and, taking the cookies in her tongs, began to reveal one by one. Thus, the Vicomte Pierre had come to Calcas to buy some gems, for here they had not received much attention and were therefore cheaper. He will be able to resell them as a luxury item at triple the price when he returns to his workshop in Nove. Earlier, Ebony recalled, the Archduke had said that the Viscount had come to Calcas with good intentions. Unless it was an outright lie, a deal with him would be favorable to Calcas. According to this arrangement, everything is going great, because the jeweler has probably already made a deal with the mine manager who was introduced to him at the club. Raven had even received a small commission thanks to this deal. Dante sighed in surprise, noting and praising her accomplishments even as a middleman. The girl smiled briefly and put the cookies on her plate, changing her face and saying that it looked like the jeweler had another motive. As she considered the next cookie in her tongs, she said that in conversation, he had brought up the subject of succession to the throne in Calcasieu on several occasions, noting that there were 2 excellent heirs to the throne. Dante frowned, then predicted that Marcus had corrected the Viscount by saying that there was a third. The implication was that he was using the shameful tactic of Nova's newcomers. Ebony looked questioningly at Dante, expecting an explanation, but he dismissed it as unimportant and asked her to tell him more about Sadel. Then the girl put down the second cookie and began to pour jam on it as a topping, and went on to say that Marcus had plans for the Jillian Meister scandal. After finishing decorating the cookies, Miss said that it seemed that the Marquis's secretary had held a conversation with a knight from the lower nobility who had nothing to do with the Sadels. Unfortunately, except for the surname Triel, the girl heard nothing. Dante thought about it, noting that if it was true, it was valuable information. Just in case, he asked her if she was sure that the information hadn't been meant for her to hear on purpose, to which Ebony replied that it was impossible, because she'd been eavesdropping. She smiled embarrassedly and admitted that she had been under the sofa on the balcony the whole time. There was a brief pause, which was broken by Dante's amused laughter, who couldn't believe that the girl had gotten this far by continuing to advance in her work. Breaking the cookie in half and handing some to her, he fed it to the girl and asked her what she would propose to do in such a situation. Ebony chewed the treat and suggested that since His Excellency intended to allow Madame Meister to inherit the estate safely, it was necessary to avoid her involvement in the scandal. But if word got out, it would be unstoppable, as Ebony knew from her own experience when she'd been slandered by the whole community. She took the tongs and held them firmly against the cookies on her plate, suggesting that she wanted to create a scandal bigger than Marcus Sadel's. A conflict involving a person of such high rank that Sadel wouldn't dare oppose, such as royalty, would be perfect. Of course, Ebony was alluding to Dante himself. Breaking open the cookie, she noted 2 merits to this strategy. The first was that those who aimed at the estate would not be able to ridicule Widow Meister, and the second was that they would smoke on lies about His Excellency owning Madame Jillian and the estate. This is the easiest way to take your enemies by surprise. Nevertheless, Ebony noted that the plan would certainly tarnish His Excellency's honor, so she apologized for her rash ideas. Dante, however, was delighted with the plan, describing it as childishly effective. He was a man, after all, so a scandal would do him no harm, but not the girl. Pulling a cracked cookie off Ebony's plate, he held it out to her mouth, apparently enjoying watching her eat from his hands, and asked what she would like as her next reward. Ebony was no longer afraid to look the Archduke in the eye and even smile, which certainly pleased his eyes. She, taking a cookie in her mouth, said that she would inform her lord of her wish only after winning the Meister's game. Naturally, this was something within His Excellency's power. The man immediately agreed, and Ebony asked why he was so sure of her. It was a question that was somewhat difficult to answer. Dante explained his point of view with things that in this world defied logic. Ebony remembered a similar feeling when she'd played craps with Sadel at the club yesterday. The wager had been extremely unprofitable for her, but she had accepted it not on a hot head, but because she was sure she would win. The Archduke agreed, saying that this was one example. He explained that people give the phenomenon many names, and when something happens that puts them in a stupor, they call it magic or a miracle, and then asked if Ebony thought their relationship was the same. At this time, Juro came to the servants laboring in the field near Meister's estate with a crate and praised a certain madam for her work. The woman sprang to her feet and ran up to him, peering into the crate. The secretary explained that she and the gentleman had heard about the birth of a baby boy to someone at the residence, so she had brought meat. The woman happily noted the Archduke's attentiveness and mused aloud about how nice it would be if His Excellency would just take over the estate. It was rude of her to say such a thing. However, she believed that it didn't matter to the peasants who the owner was, as long as they stayed fed and warm. Moreover, the woman was annoyed to report that the current owner had been a complete mess of business lately, and Lady Meister didn't even have time to worry about the common people. She brought the terrible news that the mistress of the house had whipped her elder cousin only yesterday, and that there had been a commotion in the neighborhood. Juro could not believe his ears, hoping he had heard it. The news reached His Excellency at once, and now Ebony, in the form of Raven, was rushing with all her might to Meister's manor, not believing that Jillian was capable of beating her cousin. Knocking on her door, she introduced herself to reassure her. The door opened and Ebony was horrified at what she saw. In front of her, a crying, helpless Jillian with a mangled face and neck was almost on her knees, begging for help. It seems that something completely different from what society was telling her had happened. A few days ago, Raven had crossed paths with the widow near the bank. Ebony said that their constant meetings were fateful, but Jillian was still wary of the mysterious girl. Naturally, the meetings were not accidental at all, because Ebony had been following the widow's movements, so she was able to set up the whole thing. Raven remembered that Jillian had never contacted her secretary. She thought it was embarrassing, so she offered to meet when she was done with her business or just give up the estate, which the Raven who had flown in for prey was happy to do. The widow backed away, assuring Raven that such a thing would never happen. For whatever happened, the estate was the only thing of value she would not give to anyone. The widow said the same words to her family with full confidence. Then her relatives became furious and told her to shut up and never say such nonsense again. The girl remembered all the acts of violence against her. So the shocked Raven came and asked who had done this to the poor girl. The crying and frightened widow replied that it wasn't her older cousin, and then her father and older brothers. As expected, the family framed her by saying that Jillian had attacked her cousin herself, when in reality it was the other way around. Lady Meister wept helplessly, clinging to Ebony, saying only how tired she was, how hard it was for her to cope with such a burden alone. And even if she struggled alone she would not be heard. No one would lead her away from the start, for the original plan of the family had meant getting rid of her. Ebony, listening to her speech, involuntarily remembered herself. That desperate situation when the whole world is against you and does not want to hear a word from you or in your support, which there is no one to give. A tainted woman, originally considered a commodity, a tool for achieving goals, which once out of order and acting on its own becomes unnecessary. The days she spent in prison with the thought of being hanged any day now were unbearable, especially knowing that you are innocent. Plus, your word will not be believed simply because you are a woman who has minimal rights that are not even close to a man's capabilities. Such is the fate of the disobedient and undesirable. Jillian said that this time it ended with a simple beating, but if it happens again, she doesn't know what to expect, because even in her dreams, she is in danger. After her husband's death, there were many spies among the servants, ready to kill her at any moment. Jillian screamed how scared she was, and if she had known it would hurt so much, she would have sat quietly like a mouse. Ebony looked sympathetically at the widow, wiping the tears from her eyes. In her face, she saw herself, that helpless woman who had been abandoned by the world. Raven assured her that she would make sure that Jillian wouldn't regret not running away by becoming her ally. Raven assumed that even if the widow felt helpless, frightened, she could still make a stand, knowing that someone was standing behind her and believing in her. The strange feeling never left her, for the words she spoke now from the bottom of her heart had once been the words she herself needed. She knew exactly what the helpless and tired girl wanted to hear. Ebony reminded her that she had an employer and told her that this man was above any other participant in this vulgar game for the late general's estate. He is only in it to keep everyone in line, and the estate is of no interest to him. Jillian begged the mysterious lady to help her, beginning to offer a reward in the form of the estate's income, even her own life. She was willing to give anything to get out of the series of terrible events that would lead to her death. The widow firmly assured that if those rats got the estate, she would personally burn it down. Raven liked her attitude, and she vowed to take revenge on them with Lady Meister, saying also that from this day forward, if Jillian was ever faced with a situation in which she had to make such an oath, it would be worth offering everything but her life. It was an important lesson that Ebony had learned on her own skin. Sometime later, after a few important events, Jackson along with Raven were on their way somewhere and were having a conversation. Coachman Jackson asked how His Excellency the Archduke's meeting with Mrs. Meister had gone, to which Miss replied that there was no problem. They had warned her in advance of the plan, which was based on a deliberately hyped fake scandal. Jillian also vowed to keep quiet about the whole thing. Of course, Ebony observed. The widow was a little frightened by who Raven's employer actually turned out to be, but His Excellency had spoken the right words and steered Mrs. Meister in the right direction, for she must not look so frightened at the sight of him, or no one would believe the truth of the scandal. Jillian was even willing to bear the burden, for the scandal would definitely tarnish her honor. Jackson was glad to hear of the positive outcome of the meeting, being still surprised that Madame had dared to take such a brave, selfless step for the greater good. But in his opinion, the Archduke's face had played a decisive role, though Raven countered that it was all about trusting them both, and therefore they should fully justify it. Together, they drove straight to the racetrack where the race was now taking place. The men crowded around the fence, watching to see which horse was ahead. In the midst of this crowd, Raven recognized the man they were looking for, the one who was to be the protagonist of the Sadel scandal, the retired soldier Gert Trail. Ebony couldn't believe, looking at the man, that he had once been a promising knight. Now he was a drunk, a betting addict, gulping alcohol down his throat and shouting obscene language in public. Jackson noted that he seemed to have become that way since he'd lost his arm and been discharged. The late General Meister took pity on him, and so at his own expense paid him an expensive prosthetic hand made of metal, exactly replicating the silhouette of the hand, which the man did not even hide under his clothes. Ebony stared at him, realizing that he, having received so much help and support from the late general, was going to hurt Jillian, his wife. Jackson explained that in addition to crazy people, this world is full of selfish people who don't remember the good that was presented to them. Ebony's fingers twitched involuntarily from nerves and unpleasant thoughts. So unpleasant was this sight to her. For some reason, she was afraid of men who get drunk and yell at everyone around them. Such men made her remember all sorts of unpleasant things from the past, like her late fiancé or the wardens at the prison who were not averse to taking out their anger on her. But she was stronger now, and she clenched her fists and gathered her thoughts. Ebony declared that they had nothing to fear, for they were no longer human, but trash. With a firm stride, she strode toward the former knight and snatched the bottle from his hands, then smashed it to the ground, drawing everyone's attention and urging them to talk to her. The crowd murmured, and the man exclaimed that the girl in front of him was out of her mind, calling her crazy. But she mentioned Marcus Sadel's name, a name that made a man that big shudder and frown at the realization that she smelled something. Gert leaned threateningly toward her, asking through gritted teeth who she was and what she thought she was, already beginning to threaten and put his hand behind his back, grasping the hilt of his knife. Raven smirked, realizing that she'd struck the right chord in his soul that was definitely hiding something, and suggested that they go somewhere quieter to talk. With Jackson, they stepped behind the building where no one would hear them. Gert asked how she knew so much that she'd even gotten to him, to which Raven replied that Marcus Sadel's name had connected them from the beginning, so obviously she knew the whole plan. The man made a grimace of disbelief and continued to call the girl crazy, as if mocking her. Then the mysterious stranger asked firmly if the former knight intended to talk. If not, she would immediately go to the Meister's residence and tell everything to Jillian, who would obviously hate to hear such things about Gert and Sadel. The man tensed, still holding onto the knife. He realized that a girl with such a baggage of information might not be bluffing. Clenching his fist, Gert asked what she wanted him to do, to which he received a clear answer that it was in the best interest of their side for him to step away from the case now. The man grinned. Turns out he'd already received a decent sum from the Marquis of Sadel, and strangers like them wouldn't get him to do good deeds for free. Gert decided that the girl in front of him was just as eager to take possession of the manor, so the best option would be to directly demand money from the Marquis. Raven, in response, scattering her hands, said that the man was not only stupid, but also naive. Gert was furious and ready to lunge at the girl, but he stopped when he saw Jackson's hand on the hilt of his sword. Raven continued to mock, saying that, according to the man's words, she could easily go to the Marquis and tell him that she knew a great deal, demanding money for his silence, to which he would gladly agree as long as he was not turned in. Of course, this is the most disgusting plan, because they would both be destroyed without a trace, which is a trifle for such a powerful man as Marcus Sadel. Trail had one last chance to make a decision. He would choose the one who was using him for personal power struggles, and then kill him at the end to take all the information with him to the grave. Or he would leave the city from now until the end of the Meister Games to at least preserve his human dignity. Raven assured him that Gert would get much more from the second decision than the Marquis was offering, as well as a guarantee that he would remain alive until the very end. The man squeezed his brow with his fingers, trying to make a decision, which was not easy for him right now. Whether to trust a stranger who promised a better life or to follow in the footsteps of a powerful man was a difficult question. Complicating matters was the fact that the Marquis had already given him a substantial deposit. Taking out his blade, he exclaimed that better terms could be promised by anyone, and he didn't believe empty promises unless they were backed by gold coins right at the moment. Raven lowered her head and realized the knight was adamant, but in an instant, Gert appeared behind her with a naked blade, intending to finish the girl on the spot. She didn't even have time to react before his predatory gaze was behind her. Fear made her freeze, like prey waiting for its end before attacking. But luckily, Jackson stopped the man with a deft movement. There was a crack, and then a shrill howl. Gert's arm was broken. The knife had fallen out, and the arm dangled as if it had lost control. Jackson, leaving the screaming man behind, took Raven aside and apologized for such a rude escort. It looked like the plan to persuade her hadn't worked. Though she didn't want to resort to the second plan, there was no other option, and the plan was simple. Jackson nodded and adjusted the gloves on his hands, turning back. His shadow loomed over the helpless Gert, his hands not moving at all, which begged for mercy, but orders are orders. Jackson raised a firm hand over him, and then came the sound of a blow. A street in the middle of town, people relaxing in a pub, and a girl in a red dress and a raven mask hiding from view behind a cabin door. Yes, together with Jackson, they had dragged Gert unconscious into some room to carry out the plan. But it turned out that the house had not been chosen at random, for it belonged to Jackson himself. Ebony was surprised at this, for she had hitherto thought they had entered a strange space. The servant put a bucket of ice water on her shoulder and said that if the lady continued to be so surprised, the man would discover that she was not Raven, but Miss Ebony. Then he splashed the water on the knight, and he woke up immediately. Gert opened his eyes and saw the same two silhouettes that had been demanding information from him. His hands and feet were bound tightly, so that he could not even move. Gert, twisting his head and trying to free his hands, realized he was trapped. Leaning back in his chair and resting his head against the wall, he recognized that the two men in front of him had understood the situation perfectly. Then Raven asked him to recite Marcus Sadel's orders verbatim. Then the man assured her that nothing serious was required of him, only to meet Lady Meister at the right place when she came out, and then to offer her his comfort. His task was to gain her confidence by reminding her of the late general, and if need be, to make her feel sorry for him by his appearance, reminding her of the prosthesis Meister had provided for him. The worst part was that if she remained vigilant, he would have to kidnap her. Ebony looked at the man in horror, realizing that no amount of conscience would be enough to make her feel sorry for him. She wouldn't just leave him now, for he was a danger to Jillian. Leaning toward him and giving him a menacing look, She pulled it all together. It appeared that Gert was going to approach the wife of the late general, his mentor and savior, who had nobly put in a good word for him and paid for the expensive prosthesis, make a scandal that would ruin Jillian's reputation, make some money, and then pretend he had nothing to do with the case and run away. Gert exclaimed that it was not so, for he wanted to take responsibility for Jillian, for as a widow she could not protect her estate, and so it could be taken over by anyone. It would be better to join forces with the Marquis and get money from him, and Jillian, though at first she would be angry, maybe hate him, but in the end she would change her mind if they ran away. The former knight believed that when a woman gave herself to a man, she would fall in love with him, and then she would be grateful to him. She couldn't conceive a child because she was living with an old man, but he was a young, healthy man. His countenance at that moment was ugly, resembling a rabid animal in the mating season. He was ready to forcibly conceive a child with the girl, hoping that after a while after the birth, she would be happy about it. Raven, on the other hand, recognized Gert, who considered himself a hero, as the dregs of society. Jackson asked the miss to turn away for a second, and then beat the man so that there was not a living spot left on his face. The servant waited for orders on what to do with this traitor, who changed his mind in the blink of an eye, begging for change and pleading for mercy. Of course, out of desperation, Gert threatened that they would both be in trouble when the Marquis found out what they had done, to which Raven firmly replied that he was of no value to Marcus, because the Marquis could always replace him, since he had more power. Therefore, all these naive pleas were meaningless. There were no limits to the man's elimination, and they could lock him up and leave him for dead. Raven had ordered Jackson to take care of the matter, for she was not the one to pass the final judgment on this traitor. Jackson made up his mind and again raised his firm hand over Gert's head. The next moment, he placed him unconscious in a barrel in an unknown street, and after allowing Ebony one last glance at the contents, closed the lid tightly. A short time later, Raven arrived at Lady Meister's estate. She greeted her as if she had been expecting her. Jillian asked Nanny to bring tea, but Raven stopped her, noticing a new bruise on her cheek. Someone had hit her again. The widow admitted that this time she was able to hold up better than before, which couldn't have been more gratifying. She reassured herself that there wasn't even any redness visible, just a slight blueness, but Raven wasn't happy with that. Though Jillian had endured this time, the next might be her last. She told her to forget about the tea, for she had come to the widow's house with the request that she prepare everything to leave immediately. Nanny and Jillian looked at the guest in horror and incomprehension. Sometime after all this had happened, Ebony ran into the dining room where Juro had just finished his meal and asked him what her next assignment was. The secretary exhaled, noting that although he knew Ebony was a fair person, she really didn't have much patience. The girl clapped her hands on the table worriedly, saying that they might have locked up Trail, but many people had spotted her with him leaving for the racecourse. No doubt Marcus Sadel would soon find out, and if that happened, she couldn't imagine what they would do to Jillian, who now needed protection. Juro replied cryptically that His Excellency was right, and it would be better to discuss the next plan with the Lord, rather than with him. It turns out that a banquet in honor of those who fell in battle is already expected to begin at the royal palace, where the widow is obliged to attend. And since the hyenas will also be there, she'll need a guardian. Ebony nodded, realizing that His Excellency would take responsibility for her, so she would have to discuss everything directly with him. But there was something else she wanted to ask the secretary, and that was what kind of man Jackson was. His defense and combat skills, sharp mind, and unusual eyes were too outstanding. Besides, Ebony didn't quite know what he was doing. He guarded the Archduke, owned a casino, ran a huge inn, and looked like a drunken military man. Ebony listed it all until she heard the clinking of a glass, which Juro set down forcefully on the table, stopping her train of thought and saying she couldn't talk about such things. Then he said, calmly, that it was better to ask His Excellency, for the secretary was from Calcasieu, but Jackson was a foreigner, as was the scowling chief behind him. Juro had expected an interrogation, but to his surprise, Ebony simply agreed and turned and headed for the exit. What was even more unimaginable, she wasn't going to go to His Excellency, for she saw no point in going out of her way to dig up information that Juro had no intention of revealing to her. So she was going to leave it at that, take a bath, and have dinner. Turning around, she looked at the surprised secretary, who couldn't take his eyes off her, and asked if that was right, then left him in the dining room, slamming the door behind him. This conversation took place before Raven arrived at Meister's estate, where she asked the widow to leave the mansion immediately, and told her that Jillian would be staying at the hotel for the time being until the ordeal was over. Time was short, so Raven was going to explain everything in detail on the spot. Lady Meister fidgeted, not understanding why she didn't have time to take any of her things with her at all. But Raven's plan was to pretend they were just going for a walk, but they were really running away, so it was better not to attract attention, for they did not want to alarm the spies who had been breeding in the mansion since the general's death. The mysterious girl's employer, Archduke Schneider, is to take care of Jillian while she stays at the hotel. The nanny could also go with them, for alone she would be harassed at the mansion. It remained to think of an excuse for the outing. Raven had everything in hand, so she asked to inform her relatives that Jillian was going to buy a black dress. The widow asked why, and then she had already learned about the banquet at the royal palace in honor of the fallen in battle, where she, as the wife of the late general, was to attend. Jillian grinned, and then fell to her knees, laughing hysterically and covering her face with her hand. Their country was truly unbelievable, for people weren't organizing a posthumous medal ceremony or a memorial service, but a banquet, an event for another excuse to get drunk. And this is not to mention the fact that there will be grieving families of the victims who have not even had time to take off their mourning clothes. Raven lowered her gaze to Lady Meister, assuming they were trying to forget the pain of defeat as soon as possible. But the widow feared that at the banquet, she would meet those trying to take over the estate. Raven assured her, however, kneeling down and wiping her eyes with her handkerchief, that there was nothing to worry about, for she would be accompanied by His Excellency. Lady Meister, crying, asked how they were going to get to the hotel. Raven held out her hand to help her up and told her that the carriage was ready and they would make several transfers on the way. If the widow now took the mysterious woman's hand and walked with her away from the mansion, she would become her accomplice, which she was perfectly willing to do. The hotel that Archduke Schneider had prepared for Jillian Meister was a first-class establishment and a place for long stays for nobles, merchants, and foreign ambassadors. There were only military men around, which was not good. Nanny heard that they were hired to guard the noble guests, but their worries were in vain, for on their arrival at the hotel, they were met by Jackson, who pointed to the room where His Excellency was already waiting for them. He opened the door, and the widow immediately curtsied to greet the Archduke. Dante had arrived here early, so he entered the chambers first. Besides, he had already prepared a memorial dress for the banquet and ordered to wear it when the widow went there. Moreover, if Jillian's family members wanted to meet her, they shouldn't do so, because she might lose her last chance that way. The widow thanked His Excellency and promised to remember the instructions. Dante added that Raven had already taken care of the man who planned to kidnap Jillian and hold her captive. The girls looked at each other, and the widow froze in fear, not believing her ears. Lady Meister even asked Raven if it was true, to which she received an affirmative answer that the man was acting on Marcus Sadel's orders, was horrified, covered her mouth with her hands, and then trembled and covered her face, holding back tears. Raven lifted herself up, intending to reassure the girl, saying that they had moved Lady Meister here to protect her from the hands of the Marquis, and the criminal was already locked up, so there was nothing more to worry about. Without raising her head, the widow asked if she was familiar with the person who had acted on the order. Raven paused for a moment, then called out the name of Gert Trail, the late general's apprentice. Of course, the widow remembered him and could not accept the situation anymore. A marriage of convenience to a general who was old enough to be her father had been unfair from the start. And even though they had been together for a long time, Jillian had never been able to bring herself to love him. However, the general adored her, but not out of love. She remembered well the day her late husband had asked her to look at the finished prosthetic arm that was intended for Gert. The general had told her that his apprentice had returned crippled, but was so talented and responsible that he felt bad when he heard that Trail had become depressed. The general felt that everything that had happened was a burden on his shoulders, thinking that he had not been a good enough teacher. Jillian sincerely respected the general because he was a kind and loyal man, believed that this feeling was enough to spend her whole life by his side, so she did not leave him. With horror, she tried to realize that the student whom the general loved so much had betrayed him in the foulest way. Raven revealed that Gert planned to approach the lady by mentioning the late general, and then kidnap and abuse her with the idea that Lady Meister was a widow, so surely needed a man and should be grateful for his favor. Jillian finally couldn't take it anymore. Her thoughts overflowed into her head, confused and painful to her heart. Unwilling to accept it all, she cried, exclaiming how Gert could have done such a thing. The room was filled with an atmosphere of sadness and grief, and Dante added that this was the world the widow must henceforth confront. He's dirty and unfair. This time she was lucky to have allies like him and Raven, but she couldn't know for sure what would happen in the future, so she had to learn to survive on her own and defend herself with her own strength. And those words didn't just apply to Jillian, but also to Ebony, who was now hiding behind her mask. The fight for survival will do them more good than comforting speeches. They don't need to feel sorry for each other anymore, because Jillian won't break anymore. Bowing her head and calming down a bit, the widow asked if Gert was still alive. After receiving a positive answer and wiping away her tears, she also asked what would happen if she handed him over to the court. Raven replied that the man would be acquitted, as none of his plans had been set in motion. Then Jillian stood up resolutely and walked firmly toward His Excellency, knowing that he would probably need compensation, for he was not doing charity at the moment. Jillian said she would give him anything he wanted, except her own life, if he would help her wipe out that obnoxious traitor. Dante took an apple from the platter, the fruit of sin and strife, and bit into it, declaring that the widow would then become a murderer, and asking if Lady Meister could live with the realization. Then, Jillian said that if things had gone according to the enemy's plan, she would have been expelled from the family because of her defamed body and tarnished reputation. For women in Calcasieu, this is akin to social death. Without support, she would be abused, become a beggar or a courtesan, and her life would be cut short by wounds on her body and heart. Instead of ending up so humiliated, I'd rather be a murderer. That phrase was echoed by Raven, who stood beside her. It had been decided. Dante finished the apple and left the stump, saying that he would get rid of Gert Trail, make sure he was no longer in this country or before their eyes. It was time to tell the Archduke of his wishes. He stepped aside and asked if Jillian would not mind a fair exchange. Realizing that the widow thought the Archduke would ask for the mansion, he grinned and said that although he was not a philanthropist, he was not a swindler either. The estate and the income from it belonged entirely to the widow. However, she has never managed it herself, which made things difficult, because to inherit it, Jillian needs the deceased's will and an experienced administrator. If this continues, the country will appoint a hyena as her steward. Jillian should refuse, and instead go to the Ministry of Finance, where she will be initiated into inheritance matters. Dante declared that no one would dare object if she said he was her guardian. Now the Archduke was ready to name what he wanted. He paused, looking at the faces of the girls that were eagerly awaiting his decision. Stepping closer, he smiled and pointed his hand towards Ebony, asking her to hand the academy over to her. The Meister Academy is the late general's treasured residence, to which he dedicated his life. He spent all his days at the Knight Academy, training gifted soldiers for war-torn Calcas. Dante had offered to let Jillian keep everything else, but the academy was ceded to Raven as the future chairman. Of course, the widow wasn't going to object, but as far as she knew, the academy was for men and was a training center for knights, and Raven was a lady after all. And if a lady took the chair, there would be a big scandal, which was what Dante was interested in. The fact was that the Archduke never attended social gatherings. The real purpose of his participation in the Meister's game was to put the academy in the hands of Raven, a mysterious woman whose identity Jillian could not recognize. After the conversation, Ebony and Dante returned to their estate and strolled in the garden. The Archduke could not help but notice that Lady Vonnegut had become very friendly with Jillian Meister. He allowed her, if she wished, to even maintain that trusting relationship after the inheritance case was over. However, Dante was worried that because of his sympathy for the widow, Ebony would bring up his injuries. That was what Juro had meant when he mentioned that His Excellency was right about something. He foresaw that Ebony could too get into the role and feel the pain as his own. The Archduke wanted Lady Wannick to allow herself to be a little more selfish in order to preserve her mental health. There was an awkward silence. Ebony tilted her head, pondering the words of Dante, who, a few minutes later, announced loudly that he was starving and wanted to ask Senko to cook for them, then walked briskly toward the mess hall. The sight of his worried subordinate worried him more than one might think. Ebony smiled, realizing that the formidable-looking Archduke was more caring than people usually thought. She obediently followed him into the dining room, where they were met by a not entirely pleased Senko. The chief shook off his hands and resented the fact that the gentleman never showed him an ounce of respect. Even now, Dante wanted Senko to throw a feast, even though the chief had only snuck into the kitchen. It may have been an exaggeration, of course, but the gentleman usually ate for 3. They argued for a long time, until Dante finally declared that Ebony was hungry. It changed Senko's mood instantly, and he rushed into the kitchen to do his duty. Dante politely pulled out a chair for his subordinate and sat down next to him, and Ebony decided to ask him a question about the academy. When she had first informed His Excellency that she intended to take over the academy, of course she had thought that the Archduke himself would be its owner, but for some reason he had decided otherwise. Dante stated that he had liked the idea from the beginning, and had decided from the moment he heard of the scheme to put it under Ebony's direction. His Excellency explained that the Meister Academy might have a solid reputation, but it was small in its own right, and it was also not a state institution, so it was relatively easy for them to target it. Ebony countered that if the Archduke were to suddenly appear and try to change the traditions of the academy, he would face a harsh backlash, and even in his high position, he would not be able to avoid public condemnation. But while Ebony was talking, she suddenly realized one thing, remembering the sweep. His Excellency had said he wanted to cleanse Calcus, and the targets he was trying to destroy were rogues and wealthy merchants. He can't raise a sword against them, but with Joker's help in the person of Raven, he will have the opportunity to at least investigate the shameful deeds that the scoundrels are trying to cover up. The girl realized that by putting such a valuable institution in her hands, he must be planning a coup d'etat. She assumed that His Excellency would open the academy to both men and women. Dante smiled, noting Ebony's cleverness. Indeed, with her at the helm, he would get more people to take up arms, give those who didn't already have them a chance. The Archduke handed Ebony the utensils and told her to eat well, and then they would continue brainstorming. By this point, Senko had returned with many dishes in his hands, which he held with surprising confidence, saying that rebuilding the academy would be difficult, so it would need strength. The chief had prepared so much meat that they could barely handle it, but not everyone was doing so well. At this time, Marcus Sadel stood at the window of his estate, tapping his fingers nervously on the sill and thinking about what was happening. He had recently received word that a strange woman had taken a man with a prosthetic limb aside. The informant said she had black hair and a raven mask. Marcus felt as if he had been electrocuted when the image of a charming and enchanting lady with amazing charisma popped into his mind. The first witnesses claimed that she had pretended to be a mourner who had come to the Meister estate. Then she showed up at his club and made a spectacle of herself in public. And now she's kidnapped Gert Trail and disappeared without a trace. Marcus had tried to track down the mysterious lady, but when she appeared, she always changed carriages to cover her tracks. His fist slammed against the surface of the windowsill. The Marquis could not understand whose pawn this raven was that she was so cleverly ruining his plans. She had even managed to persuade Jillian Meister to leave the manor. And even though he had found out her whereabouts, it was impossible to lure the widow out of the hotel, no matter how the spies tried. It's extremely difficult to get past the military guards, but the most vexatious thing of all was quite another. The other day, Jillian Meister visited the Ministry of Finance, accompanied by the Archduke Schneider, presenting him as her guardian, and demanded that she be given an official course in the administration of the estate. At the sight of His Excellency, the man at the reception desk even jumped up from his seat, standing up straight and directing all his attention to the Archduke, as if he had not noticed his companion. He began to ask what had brought such a busy man to the Ministry of Finance. Dante, frowning, pointed out that he wasn't actually alone, and the matter for the man wasn't with him, but with Lady Meister. The girl confidently stated that she was here to take a formal course in manor management, as the rightful heir to the late general's estate. The man, adjusting his glasses, stated that the widow could register for the course today, but was unlikely to be able to handle it, since the curriculum at the Ministry of Finance was taught in the national language of the continent. Jillian stated that she could only speak Caucasian, so she would need an interpreter. The man looked at some papers and replied indifferently that, unfortunately, the widow's request was not within the ministry's competence. At that moment, Dante came up and said that the solution was simple, because he would take on the job of interpreter. The Archduke could speak 2 languages, so it wouldn't be a problem. The man couldn't understand why His Excellency was willing to go so far, but Dante said with a contemptuous look, arms crossed, that the ministry's situation was so dire that they couldn't appoint an interpreter, and since there was nothing they could do about it, he would have to do the job. The man bowed his head guiltily and apologized. The receptionist also added that he was just a simple employee, so they needed to hold a meeting within the ministry first. He said that it would take a week, but under the Archduke's menacing gaze, the time was reduced to 3 days. The conversation ended and the Archduke led Lady Meister to eat desserts and tea after the stress she had been through. Dante was incredibly angry at everything, saying that based on the hardships of the lives of ordinary servants, one would not want to have a bad opinion of them, yet they allow themselves to easily change their minds depending on who is in front of them. But at least Lady Meister would be officially educated in 3 days. Jillian looked down at her plate in embarrassment and didn't touch the dessert while Dante devoured the chocolate cake. He noticed her shyness and assumed that the treat was not to her taste, to which she immediately objected. Jillian picked up her fork, but her hand was visibly shaking with excitement. Dante glanced toward the door, where the servants who had been peeking at them were passing by, and then whispered to the widow to relax a little, for their first task was to spread the word. The girl tried to eat naturally and casually, but continued to shake. The Archduke remarked wryly that she was a terrible actress. He mentally imagined how Ebony would have done in her place. It took Lady Vonnegut only a month to get used to the raven mask, to become one with it, and to gain a second mysterious identity. Even Juro had once remarked how talented she was, and if she had been born in another country and educated early, she could have made a good reputation for herself. Dante thought that Ebony was uncomfortable with the secretary, but the man had rightly said that personal emotions were unacceptable when assessing a person's strengths. It was a completely honest and objective assessment, especially from such a pedantic man. Suddenly, Jillian announced that her father was coming to see her today, which made the Archduke shudder. It was possible that he was already in cahoots with Marquis Sadel. He was saying that after His Excellency got the estate, he would dispose of her like a pair of old rags, so she should come to her senses. Dante grinned, thinking the people around him were stupider than he expected. Even with Jillian's acting so awful, they think he and the widow have something going on. But it was situations like this that made him ask to avoid seeing anyone. Jillian apologized, but revealed that it was not her initiative. Her father followed the nanny to the hotel and forcibly entered the room. Dante asked to wait a little longer, because sooner or later the father would stumble. The girl obediently agreed, comparing her family to a pack of hungry wolves. Dante ended the conversation with an expression of joy that everyone was all right. Again, there was an awkward silence, and people continued to stare at them, waiting for something interesting to happen. Jillian began to panic and wondered what she should say. Anything would do, but not the oppressive silence that was breaking the atmosphere. Lady Meister remembered that she must speak to the Archduke as if she were his woman, and decided to ask him a question. Running her fork across her plate and smearing the cream of the cake, she asked if it was for Raven's sake that His Excellency was playing these vulgar games. No matter how she thought about it, there was no benefit to the Archduke. Not the game, not the contract with her, not everything else. Then Dante replied, sipping his tea, that Jillian's thoughts were correct. Having received such an ambiguous response, Lady Meister asked if Raven was His Excellency's mistress. There was silence after this uncomfortable question. Jillian had already despaired, thinking that she had made the mistake of thinking only of how to make it appear to those around her that they were having a close relationship. If she wanted to be seen as His Excellency's mistress, naturally she should cultivate another woman, a lady, that would look perfect next to him. And the only one that came to her mind was Raven. Dante broke the silence by placing the cup on the table with a clink and saying that this was not their relationship. Lady Meister breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that the subject was not taboo. But the Archduke admitted that her sudden question about him and Raven had taken him by surprise. With a smile, he added that the masked lady still had a lot to learn, and a frivolous thing like love would only be a hindrance for her right now. For Raven, a romantic relationship would be the perfect cure for boredom when she had already achieved her goal. Jillian asked why she was wearing the mask, to which Dante, after a little silence, replied with a smile that it was a secret. It was a secret that was known only to the narrowest circle. In the morning, Ebony had a terrifying dream. It was a memory from the past, when she was still spending her days in detention. The memory played cruelly with her, replaying events from the past. The wardens were waking the girls on bath day, and her friends were trying to get Ebony up so they wouldn't be beaten for disobedience once again. Lady Vonneck jumped up on her bed as if from a loud sound, a shout for her to wake up. Pulling open the curtains, the girl found that she was up again at the crack of dawn. But she couldn't go back to sleep, so she stomped barefoot into the kitchen. There she found Senko, who was already busy working. She walked over to him and stood next to him by the side table and gathered up her hair. The chief was indignant that Miss was awake early again, though he had repeatedly asked her to get up later. Ebony waved her eyes open involuntarily and offered to help peel the potatoes. Senko sighed, saying how wonderful his lady was, but he couldn't trust her with such a dirty job, so he asked her to arrange the fruit nicely on a plate. Ebony said, as she took 2 ripe apples in her hands, that everyone was eager to see the fruit in the same beautiful position that Senko usually had them in, so she would do her best. But suddenly someone took one of the apples from her hand. It was the sleepy doctor who was eating an apple with unwashed hands. Senko angrily reprimanded the doctor for being unclean, but she waved off that she had already washed her hands and was hungry. Slapping Ebony on the shoulder, the doctor told her not to worry and to just leave the fruit on the table for everyone to eat like her. Miss was indignant, but saw Marta doing the same thing, noting that if you ate the fruit that way, you wouldn't have to do the dishes, which would make the job easier. Granny chuckled that Senko would never find a wife without realizing it, to which she received indignant shouts from the man on the sidelines. The old woman, eating an apple, remembered that the inconsiderate king was having a banquet today. Of course, she called him a ruder name, so that Ebony choked on the piece of fruit she had been eating for company. Martha began to apologize for her rudeness, even though it was true. The old woman explained that the king is old, stupid, and stubborn, nothing but a vile parasite. He interferes in other people's conflicts at his own discretion and fleeting desire, resulting in a huge number of casualties. Nor can he offer a dime to the families of the dead soldiers, as he is obliged to pay a contribution to the victorious country. And now he wants to organize a banquet, although he should know his place and show a sense of tact. Looking at the apple, Ebony assumed that His Excellency, who was to accompany the widow, was already well acquainted with Jillian. The doctor remembered that with the gentleman's temper, it would be a miracle if he showed up at the banquet at all. But since he had run out of patience this year, it would be hard on everyone. Lady Vonneck asked if the king and his nephew, the Archduke, had a strained relationship, to which each of the servants replied that Dante hated him, once even said his head was rotten, and from time to time did not hesitate to call him unflattering words. Butler Benjamin said the same thing to her, though in a milder form, noting that the Archduke was quite frank in expressing his feelings. But, except for his expressiveness, the servant shared such political views. At that moment, Benjamin was just about to give another riding lesson to Miss, who was already deftly able to climb onto the horse on her own. Ebony said that she also fully agreed with His Excellency's position. The butler smiled sarcastically, surprised that so many people had given the king such a flattering assessment. After all, his deeds were exceptional in a way. Benjamin then announced that someone else would give today's riding lesson, and he remembered that he had not completed one urgent matter. Taking off his hat, he bowed and walked away into the dark corridor of the stable. A few moments later, another figure, the supposed teacher, emerged. It was Dante himself, who remarked with a smile that although the girl was otherwise good, she needed a little practice at riding. As the man got on his horse, Ebony replied that she was bad at everything, but that she would do her best today. According to Juro, however, her words were not true, for the secretary constantly praises her. Since the girl is great with many things, His Excellency asked Juro to compliment her in advance. Dante then decided to go, not knowing where. Ebony could read unmistakably from his face that he did not want to go to tonight's banquet, and she asked him directly. Though the Archduke denied her assumption, she was right. His Excellency stared forward again, calling the king a crazy fossil, but his negative attitude was interrupted by the cheerful laughter of the girl, who evidently enjoyed this amusing insult. As soon as Ebony was done, she apologized. But Dante, with his already natural smile, asked her to smile more often, because that made her look even more beautiful than usual. Ebony looked at him in bewilderment and embarrassment, and followed. It was time for the banquet, and the guests had been gathered for a long time. Only one component was missing. Everyone in the hall whispered as soon as a voice was heard apologizing for being late. People looked at the couple who had arrived and discerned Lady Meister accompanied by Archduke Schneider. It looked like the next owner of the estate had been decided. Behind the curtain was a furious Marcus Sadel, who couldn't believe that Dante had beaten him so handily, leaving him no chance. He darted through the crowd, pushing people aside and making his way forward, wondering how a redneck like Jillian could have come to be on the arm of such an important person as the Archduke. Sweating from overexertion and stress, Marcus exclaimed, calling Jillian a slutty woman who had come to her late husband's wake with a new lover. Now she would not be forgiven, even if she bowed before the general's grave. But the widow calmly replied that it was even more impolite to raise her voice at a memorial service, which showed Marcus's inability to behave like a gentleman. The Marquis was stumped, not knowing what to say, and then Dante dealt a decisive blow to his confidence, saying that he should not be so rude to a frail lady, for he was a man who did not tolerate lies, as he called himself. Marcus turned around and, unable to find anything to say, walked away, angry and humiliated. He didn't give even a hint of what he was going to do next, and one would have thought that would be the end of it. But things were more complicated than that. On the way back to the hotel, Lady Meister could not stop thanking His Excellency. Ebony, sitting in the library late at night with the secretary, mused on everything and was glad that the widow was now safe, but not everything was settled yet, for inheritance was a very long process. Juro nodded and added that perhaps this was only the beginning. The secretary announced the first assignment for today for Ebony. She must predict the next steps Marcus Sadel would take. Thinking, Miss assumed he would raise objections to the treasurer of the noble's finances. The answer was close, but not specific. Juro explained that the Ministry of Financing of Nobles is the federal agency for checking the assets of nobles. It controls the processes of inheritance, transactions of nobles, but in addition, it is also known for its inaction and non-interference in illegal transactions, except in egregious cases, to which it will not turn a blind eye. Ebony then asked who held the highest office in the ministry, to which the secretary replied that it was naturally the treasurer, but above him was the chancellor, who was in charge of the national money circulation. The treasurer is a marquis and the chancellor a duke. Miss drew ridiculous drawings on paper to better understand the hierarchy. After looking at everything and thinking better of it, Ebony said that in that case, Sadel would work with the treasurer, because His Excellency the Chancellor is next in line to the throne, and the treasurer has the same title as Marcus Sadel, so it's a great opportunity for a corrupt nexus. Juro leaned back a little, looking at the girl. He liked her answer, but he wanted more specifics. He asked her who she thought would be the next ruler of the country. Putting his glasses on the table, Juro added that he didn't have to give an answer now, and began to write something on the paper where Ebony was drawing, saying that the whole matter was tied up in the struggle for the throne. The Chancellor supports the second prince, while the Supreme Court nominates the first. As soon as Marcus chooses one faction, he immediately becomes an opponent of the other. He unexpectedly received the title of Marquis while still very young. Among all these monsters, wolves on the battlefield, Sadel seems like a small child. And then Ebony breathed, continuing after Juro, that Marcus could not openly approach the Chancellor, who supported the second prince, for that would give the wrong impression that he was also among his supporters. The secretary also added that if the Marquis was captured by the followers of the first prince, the situation would become fatal, as he had only recently become one of the participants in the political arena. Ebony sighed disappointedly as she finished listening to Juro, realizing why the answer was inaccurate, which surprised the secretary. He recognized that this woman had a keen sense of intuition, for she was able to get to the truth with little or no knowledge of the political structure of this world. Ebony, clutching the piece of paper in her hands, asked if her assignment was to stop Marcus from joining forces with the treasurer. Juro stated that it was likely that Sadel had been in cahoots with him for a long time, but was holding it off as a last-ditch effort. He couldn't spring into action just now. Putting on his cloak, the secretary announced the second task. They need to come up with a follow-up on this matter. That was His Excellency's order. Unravel the entire scheme. Juro peeks into the gentleman's office and asks if Ebony can handle such a complex issue. She is certainly intelligent, but she has no political streak, which is typical of a Caucasian woman. But Dante stated that the secretary did not seem to know Ebony very well. Lighting up, he added that she is an unusual Caucasian woman and the respected daughter of an earl, imprisoned on a murder charge at the age of 18. It is for this reason that she is brave, cold-blooded at the right moment, and uninhibited by rules. And Juro should know this better than anyone else. The secretary did not understand why His Excellency would entrust such a serious matter to Lady Vonnegut, despite the audacity of her nature. But Dante assured him that Ebony would definitely come up with an innovative strategy instead of acquiring Meister Manor by crushing her opponents with his status. Juro stood staring at the Archduke in bewilderment. Dante realized from the expression on his face that he still doubted him. Then His Excellency, turning away to the window, told the secretary in times of boredom to go and look at the prisoners of Spite Prison, to inquire what conversations Ebony had had there and with whom, to look at her experiences in 5 years. Then the secretary's opinion would change. Juro hurried into the study, typing up a lot of material with the goal of learning more about this woman. In the meantime, Ebony was still sitting in the study, thinking things over carefully, intent on figuring out what she could even do to stop Marcus Sadel. Her master has assigned her this task because he believes she will find the answer. Juro, on the other hand, was agonizing over the reason why the Archduke trusted Lady Vonnegut so much. He searched the documents frantically for something that could be made her weapon, and at some point, he did come across something interesting. In the morning, there was a shout from Ebony, who ran with all her might to the office of His Excellency, who was dozing at his desk. She ran joyfully into his office and clapped her hands on the desk, declaring that she had found the solution to the problem that had been set. Noticing that she'd woken Dante, she apologized, to which he said he was glad to hear from her and asked her to be brave in talking to him. Ebony then explained her decision in order. In the red light district, in Lanson, there is a brothel called Sabrina. Lady Vonnegut has asked to be allowed to meet the person living there, a girl named Patricia, who is the Chancellor's secret mistress. It is rumored that the Chancellor has been staying in Lanson with her for quite some time. And since Ebony realized she couldn't win the treasurer to their side with money or force, she could give her lover some information through Patricia. Dante wondered with a smile what that information was. Then the girl continued with Juro explaining that the Chancellor supports the second prince, which means that he will fear the Archduke as a member of the royal family, as well as the Marquis, because the latter remains neutral. Therefore, leaving the estate to the widow would be the most peaceful solution. That was the message she wanted to send. The Archduke asked what if the Chancellor granted the estate to someone else. Lady Vonnegut replied without hesitation that in that case they would suggest that the Marquis of Sadel take the matter to court. His Excellency thought that if the plan worked, that would be the best solution. Dante smiled and, taking off his cloak and throwing it over the shoulders of the girl who stood before him in a shirt, said that he already believed in her, but each time she surprised him more and more. He thanked her and offered to tell the less intelligent people in the palace about her wonderful idea. But when Ebony came and told the servants, she received a sharp refusal and protest from all. Benjamin, horrified at the whole scheme, began to tell, intimidating the naive Ebony, that this quarter was the abode of iniquity, built by vile rich men. Moreover, the street was inhabited only by robbers, rogues, pimps, and assassins, so there was no way they could send Lady Wannock there alone. But Ebony argued that she would not be harmed and should go alone. The reason was simple. The Chancellor's mistress lives there, and Miss had an idea how to convince her. It was a good thing Juro wasn't around at that moment, who would surely have fainted by now. Benjamin asked if she would go as Raven, but Miss said she'd better reveal her real name since Patricia probably hasn't had many visitors since she became the Chancellor's mistress. It also meant that Ebony wouldn't be able to bring Jackson with her. And none of the servants can be dragged along because someone might recognize them, and they need to proceed with caution. Ebony folded her hands in front of her and bowed slightly, thanking him for his concern for her but assuring him that he would not do anything dangerous. Still, His Excellency had no intention of letting her go there alone. The shocking news was that Martha's company was already in full swing, and although the old lady seems frail, she can still be useful and unexpectedly strong in some situations. Then, under the chief's cries of pleading to take him along, they went straight to their destination. After a short distance, they put on their robes. They were going to walk the rest of the way, so that people wouldn't suspect anything when they saw the carriage coming. Stopping the messenger boy, Ebony said she had an errand for him. Then the boy said that if the destination was not far away and the luggage was light, they would be charged 30 silver. But if the destination was far away and the luggage was heavy, the trip would cost a fortune. Martha grinned, whispering that the boy knew how to do business. Ebony handed the boy a red envelope with a gold wax seal and asked him to deliver it to Patricia from Sabrina. The boy looked at the envelope, tilted his head, and remembered that everyone was asleep there now. But for 50 silver pieces, he changed his face and led them cheerfully to the right door. On the way, Ebony asked Martha why His Excellency had asked the old lady to accompany her, to which the grandmother replied that she made a good impression on people. Indeed, the fellow was so affable that one could well believe it. They rounded the corner and bumped into the back door. It was smart, since others wouldn't be able to see them here. The boy walked the ladies to their room and left. Ebony exhaled and opened the door with a slightly trembling hand. A voice familiar to Lady Wannock hurried them on, demanding that they not delay if they dared tear her from her sweet slumber. In front of them sat a middle-aged lady in a robe with bright scarlet curls who introduced herself as Patricia. And as it turned out, the woman knew Ebony well. Lady Wannock was surprised at this, to which the courtesan replied that despite her venality, she could still remember her comrades. She asked why Ebony hadn't mentioned the name of their old official language teacher from the prison, and why the famous Wannock was looking for the old courtesan. Ebony folded her hands in her lap and firmly assured that Patricia was not a courtesan. Their teacher, who had been imprisoned for teaching the girls the official continental language, said that Patricia had fallen in love with the Chancellor and was now living in a brothel to please him, which made the teacher's heart break. Lady Wannock noticed Patricia's wisdom, though her sarcasm, as well as her kindness that hid behind her coldness. The scarlet-haired woman clenched her teeth and wondered if the teacher had not then said that she had better not like the Chancellor. In spite of all the contradictions and dangers, the teacher dared not stand in the way of her student, for it was entirely Patricia's choice, to whom the wise woman wished only happiness. When she heard this, the mistress leaned back and said she was sorry that her life had been derailed by unhappy love. When she heard that the teacher had been imprisoned, she felt as if the heavens had fallen upon her. Patricia begged Samuel, the Chancellor, for help, for it cost him nothing to save one woman's life. But there was no choice, for the man claimed that the Treasury Department could not interfere with the decisions of the Justice Department, which her mistress knew perfectly well. Covering her face with her hand and leaning her head back, Patricia recalled how the Chancellor had kept her in the loop, as if he were doing her a favor. She had even managed to get 4 letters from her teacher from her place of confinement. But for all that, the Chancellor had never mentioned one thing: how the teacher had died. Through her fingers, the mistress glanced at Ebony. Patricia's hands tensed, and her long red fingernails scratched the armrests of the chair. To the fact that the man who had raised her, given her the opportunity to live and then passed away, Samuel had only replied that death was inevitable, so she shouldn't dwell on it. The woman slammed her fist on the armrest, frustrated that even though she pleaded with him to tell her about her teacher's death, he hadn't said a word to her. Patricia then recalled that it had been about 3.5 months since Ebony had been released. The woman was sure that Lady Wannick had come here with a request, but she had asked to hear her out first. She wanted to know if the teacher's death was natural, where her body rested, who was at the funeral. Well, if anyone had a hand in her death, she longed to know their names. Ebony realized that her mistress was intent on revenge. She recognized that it made no sense, especially now, and if Samuel found out about it, he would be furious. But even if the man was that awful, he really needed Patricia. Samuel would never put her in danger. The woman stood up from the creaking chair, holding on to the back as Ebony wondered if, after learning the truth, she would be able to honor her request, or indeed trust her. Patricia came over and put a hand on Lady Vonnick's shoulder, leaning over slightly and saying that since her teacher had raised her like her own daughter, they were like sisters. So the woman with a cold look asked her not to be afraid and to tell her everything as it was, as well as the reason why she was looking for her, because being the Chancellor's woman in this country was very useful. Patricia had been cautious with Ebony, but she was willing to listen to her, so Lady Vonnick believed her, hoping there would be no questions left after the story was told. Ebony said, squeezing Martha's hand to make sure she knew that Patricia was more than just the Chancellor's mistress. In fact, she is the authorized secretary to the Chancellor, who trusts no one, not even his blood relatives. Ebony asked her to tell him that it would be best if the Meister estate was given to Jillian Meister. Patricia asked how Ebony had heard about her relationship with Samuel, since it was a big secret, to which Ebony smilingly recalled that their teacher had been a gossip and had heard it from her. The mistress grinned and agreed, then said she would tell the Chancellor, but that wasn't exactly what Lady Vonnick had in mind. She wanted her mistress to hint at the need for him to consider such an option, to stand firm that it was the wisest solution to the problem. Patricia recoiled, eyes widening, realizing that her interlocutor wanted her to lie to Samuel, the one who trusted her unconditionally and more than anyone else in the world. With a trembling hand, she touched her forehead, hiding her shock, and asked again if Ebony wanted her to deceive a man that, though bad, was unhappy. Lady Vonnick stood her ground, trying to get an answer. Then the mistress asked if Archduke Schneider was behind Ebony's back. Lady Vonnick shuddered and, wrapping herself in her robe, repeated Patricia's words that she would ask no questions. Her mistress, on the other hand, waved her hands and said that Ebony was boring. She recalled that their teacher had been very careful with people, but she herself was not noted for such abilities. But Lady Vonnick had succeeded, and she didn't look like a loser. Setting the cups on saucers, Patricia also remembered that the teacher had labeled Ebony as the smartest student she had ever taught, so the mistress was always envious. Lady Vonnick is boring, but also quite charming. It wasn't long before Patricia learned that Ebony was working for the Archduke, but that didn't matter anymore. And even if she had asked for something more horrible, her mistress would still have agreed to fulfill her request. But before Patricia asked to fulfill her request, to avenge her teacher, Ebony set down her teacup and stated that revenge was not necessary. Patricia suggested that the teacher had died because of illness, but that was not entirely true. The cause of demise was overwork and the denial of proper treatment. The mistress gritted her teeth and growled that the person who had caused her to go down with overwork was guilty in that case, as well as the doctor who had refused to treat her. But Ebony said that both people who might have been involved were dead. There were many prisoners there, those people who were connected to the teacher. It was unknown who might have had a hand in it exactly, because they didn't ask too many questions and closed their eyes deliberately. But they knew for sure that those involved had been in the other world for a long time. They also failed to hold a funeral, but Ebony knew where the late teacher's body lay. After finishing their conversation with Patricia, they went out into the street, which looked busier than it had in the morning when they had first arrived. It was said that there were more bars and courtesans in this place than there were rats in Lanson. Such was the red light district, the underworld of Calcas. It was approaching lunchtime, and there were suspicious men standing on the corners, ready to drag them down a dark alley. Martha pulled Ebony's hood tighter over her head and whispered to her not to answer anyone who spoke to her. Since all the bars were now closed, they had to walk to the inn to get a carriage. Martha led Lady Vonnick by the hand, while Ebony pondered the fact that after 5 years, her face should have been forgotten by now. But if they drew even the slightest bit of attention, it could be a serious problem. Suddenly, their trek began to be blackened by the voices of the men behind them, who tried to call out to the girl, to beg her to take off her hood, to pursue, or even worse, to sell out. Still, they had to take one of Patricia's wagons, but it was too late for regrets. Suddenly, a thick and tall figure of a man appeared in front of them, who for some reason thought that the ladies were looking for a brothel. He grabbed Ebony's arm and asked if she had any experience in providing such services. The man was just huge, disgusting, and also drunk. Ebony looked at him with a blank stare full of fear, for drunken men who were loud and big caused her genuine terror. But Martha saved the situation by pushing the big man away from the girl. The old woman's hand was much stronger than the man's, who immediately recoiled in surprise. His mouth seemed to stitch together in a surprising way. His lips closed, and he lost the ability to speak. The old woman said that it was not proper to shout at elders and put her finger to her lips with a smile. Something was definitely wrong with this grandmother. The man, stumbling as if under hypnosis, followed the old woman's command in the direction they wanted to go. Now they had a perfect guide, which also kept away unwanted stares. Ebony followed the old woman's hand in surprise, not understanding how she managed to pull this off. At last, they came to the road where they were to be met by His Excellency, but Martha crossed her arms and jeered that Dante was late again, cursing him with profanity. At that moment, the carriage pulled up, and the Archduke looked out, questioning what the old woman had called him. Martha noticed again that if she insulted him, he would be right there. She no longer hesitated to continue swearing that since their master was an unemployed bum, he had personally come to greet them, and thanks to this, the old lady would be able to plunge into luxury for a while. They hastily got into the carriage, and Ebony shifted her gaze to the bigwig. Martha ordered him to climb in with them, and the man crawled into the carriage on all fours. Lady Vonnegut was so frightened that she climbed into His Excellency's lap. Though it was still unclear why they needed him, Dante said Jackson knew exactly what use he could be. That same day at sunset, Marcus Sadel stood thinking about his plan, while two men who had seen him were talking behind him. They were talking about how it had been a long time since the Marquis had last visited the salon, and it looked like he would finally be able to relax. Widow Meister suddenly decided to take the inheritance for herself, but her efforts are in vain because she continues to be oppressed. She still could not get her share, although she prepared all the contracts, documents, went through a whole series of procedures, which emphasized special attention. It seems that in the end, the rumors that the Marquise will lose her wealth were true. It remains to be seen who will win in the end, the Duke or the Marquis. The men flinched when Marcus approached them and asked what they had dug up on the same crow-masked broker, on the mysterious woman Raven. One of the men said he had asked around the people near the border post, but couldn't find anything that led to her. But Marcus was sure it was because women with black hair abound, and she was hard to identify behind the mask. Then Sadel asked about whether Viscount Pierre knew anything about her. Of course, the man gave a few clues, but they were rather superficial and obvious. The Vicomte talked mostly about her being a capable broker, and though he didn't know where she came from, the girl did favor Nova's trends, and she had a better command of the official language than some of the nobles. He also added that she is accompanied by a guardian with a scar on his lip, whose name is Jackson. Also, interestingly enough, she has no interest in her own enrichment. That was the end of it, and absolutely nothing useful was found. There was a chance that the Viscount had deliberately left out some details, but it looked like he was on Raven's short leg. Marcus hesitated, tapping his foot nervously. If they were to believe what the employee at the hotel where Jillian Meister was staying said, Raven had once appeared near the widow, which meant that the stranger was somehow connected to the owner of the estate, or someone of a different higher position. Marcus ordered the informants to continue their work and lit a cigarette himself, glad that he still had the treasurer under his control. He had done everything possible to ensure that Jillian Meister would not get the inheritance, and when the widow got tired of waiting, the estate would be sent to auction. The Marquis believed that in such a situation, even the untouchable Archduke would not be able to change anything. But suddenly, hurried footsteps were heard from outside. It was the man from the reception desk at the Ministry of Finance, who said that there was a problem because His Excellency the Chancellor had personally summoned the treasurer and ordered that the widow should inherit the estate. Marcus shuddered, and his entire plan, which had seemed foolproof, snapped at the seams. The Marquis shrieked, asking how this could have happened. But the man put his finger to his lips and said that the information must not get out. Marcus stomped his heel with such force that the floor cracked beneath him. He had gotten it right. They had no choice as this order was coming from the Chancellor himself. Originally, the treasurer really didn't intend to do that, but it seems that he was forced to change his mind. In despair, the Marquis slammed his fist against the wall and began to scream in despair that everything was over. It seemed that the bird had finally fallen into the jaws of a predatory snake. Juro wandered into the study where Ebony was sitting reading a book. She greeted him with a smile, but then noticed that he looked rather tired, as if he had been working without rest for days. Ebony asked what had happened, to which she received only a backhanded question about who she was. Juro explained that the Chancellor of the Ministry of Finance of Calcas, Samuel Price, had issued a decree that the Treasurer of Noble Finance had authorized Jillian Meister to inherit the late General's estate. Ebony was certainly glad of the news, but Juro demanded an answer to his question. He couldn't even guess how the girl had managed to pull something like that off in a short period of time. Ebony replied that she had simply solved the problem, but it was a bit difficult to explain. She put the book down on the table and lowered her gaze, thinking. Ebony then began to run her finger over the palm of her hand and explained that she knew a man who knew the Chancellor's mistress, Patricia. So she found out about the relationship and was sure that the mistress would agree to her request if she met her secretly and talked to her. Juro lowered his gaze, unable to realize what the girl was thinking at that moment, how she had even survived the last 5 years and endured the people she interacted with. It was astounding, for no one else in Calcas would be looking for the secret mistress of the Chancellor of the Ministry of Finance, except for the woman who sat across from him. The secretary asked if she was the woman from the brothel that had accompanied Price. Ebony jumped up and confirmed his words, but explained that Patricia was not really a courtesan. Juro was stunned again, for according to his investigation, that was exactly what had happened. Ebony sighed and, waving her hands, explained that she could not disclose the details, for they were Patricia's private affairs, but that Juro's earlier judgment of her had been a mistake. Grasping her head and fixing her hair, the secretary, unable to believe his words, confirmed that the woman had managed to persuade the Chancellor, and that was how it had turned out. Then he asked about the price of such an important deal. Ebony replied that they had agreed on favorable terms. Juro, turning away, hinted that he provided always to her the information he could without a drop of falsehood, which Lady Vonnegut remembered perfectly well and thanked regularly. But for all that, the secretary felt that the girl was withholding something from him, and it made him angry. Then the lady bowed and apologized, and Juro finally examined her, distracted. The wounds on her body were almost gone, her pupils clear, and her posture straightened. She no longer mumbles or hesitates to speak her mind. And now this girl was keeping a secret from him, openly admitting that it was better to apologize in order to continue keeping things secret. Juro swallowed the lump in his throat and asked her to promise only one thing. He stepped closer and, fists clenched, told her to swear that she would never become a criminal again, and that she would never hurt another human being. Ebony looked away and was silent, and then replied that Mr. Juro must know why she had been taken into custody. Naturally, he knew that Count Vonnegut and Victor Sadel were with her at that moment. But still, the secretary had one more question. Ebony interrupted him, however, asking if Juro still thought she was the murderer. He doesn't even suggest that her actions were self-defense after all. Juro stared at the girl in a stupor, who looked at him confidently and firmly sure of her words. He admitted, looking away awkwardly, that perhaps she had. But in his opinion, it was by coincidence or accident. The fact remained that the girl had killed those men. Ebony interrupted him, saying that she had no motive or desire to kill them, for she merely wanted to survive, and that such a thing could hardly be considered a crime. She asked him whether she was a villain, a question that did not seem to require an answer, Ebony demanded a promise from him that he would not treat her the way those two men did since he was asking her for something. Lady Wannick revealed that 5 years ago, she killed her fiancé who was going to abuse her. Her father pursued her for reprisals to restore the family's honor, but the court handed down a death sentence for her deeds. To Juro, a genius, the youngest among those who had ever taken the bar exam, the law had always been beyond question. But at that moment, an unshakable and unconditional faith had been shaken. In his heart, he realized that Ebony's words were the truth to which everyone had turned a blind eye. The next day, Ebony practiced riding with Benjamin as scheduled. The butler praised her progress, and the girl was glad she had such a wonderful mentor. The servant, however, decided to share her selfish wish since he was her mentor in the matter. He wanted to see Miss become as excellent a horsewoman as the Queen of Babylon. Ebony, of course, wanting then to be able to elude the wild tribes on horseback, thought she would still have a lot to learn. The butler had joked that she just needed to become as skillful as he was, but the girl recognized that it would take a long time for that too. At that moment, Mrs. Horse reached for the butterfly, making to eat it, and the girl laughed, telling him it was not food. From the side, Martha and the doctor were watching this. The old lady resented that the butler was always making fun of her, but as soon as it came to the horses, she became kinder at once, and the doctor was pleased to see Mrs. Smile growing wider and more sincere. Martha couldn't help but agree, for at first she didn't even realize whether the lady was laughing or crying. Suddenly, the doctor looked away and pointed in that direction. When the old woman looked in the right direction, she saw the 2 young maids who had been shy with Lady Wannick at first because of the rumors about her. There was no contempt on their faces now, and Martha was glad the misconceptions had dissipated. The maids noticed the surveillance and, afraid that they would be reprimanded for their idleness, shyly deflected and ran off to do their chores, leaving their incredible mistress to watch them. Perhaps they were jealous of her riding skills, for this pleasure was not available to the girls. It was an indication, however, that the lady was doing right, for Ebony's hard work had touched the hearts of these young girls, who, hidden behind the wall from the eyes of Martha and the doctor, watched with admiration the graceful figure of the miss on horseback. Night had fallen, but Ebony was still awake, looking out the window and remembering their conversation with Patricia, who resented the fact that the late teacher's body was still on Spate's property. They had left her in a place known only to them, and that was the best they could offer at the time. Patricia at first flared up, but then covered her face with her hand, realizing that everything had been done to the best of the girl's ability. Ebony understood that she was grieving, but still asked permission to take care of the funeral, as she had more freedom of action in the outside world than the Chancellor's mistress, to which the woman agreed and asked to be informed when they would take the body to visit the teacher. Ebony reached for the window and mentally talked to the girls who were seeing her off. She wanted to show them that she was still alive and doing well, but she was distracted from her deep thoughts by a question from outside about the beautiful night landscape outside. It was His Excellency who decided to check on her and ask her why she was still awake, to which she replied that her head was full of thoughts that kept her awake. But she cheerfully reported that she had heard from Mr. Juro that Jillian had been allowed to inherit the estate. Dante confirmed that with a smile and said that there was only a bit of paperwork left, but he had lent her Juro to finish things faster and favorably in every way. They were both pleased that the plan had worked as well as it could and had led to the desired outcome. After a moment's silence, Dante headed back to the balcony where he'd come from and sat down on the railing. Looking out over the night garden, he thoughtfully suggested to Ebony that they take a walk under the stars. The girl asked where they would go, as suddenly His Excellency jumped down, scaring the girl out of her wits. Ebony ran up, trying to call out to Dante, but saw him standing below, unharmed. He held out his hand to her with a smile and offered to jump down to him. And even though it was the 2nd floor, the girl was afraid of hurting herself. Then the man held out his hands to her and assured her that he would catch her, so she had nothing to fear. Ebony climbed over the fence and slowly slid down it. Suddenly, it was as if she felt invisible steps in the air beneath her feet, and her fear evaporated. She thought that, perhaps because His Excellency was near, she felt a very familiar sense of lightness, the same as she had felt at Sadel's club when she'd made the bet. the same magic Dante had told her about afterward. The girl landed softly in His Excellency's arms. He grinned, noting that it was no big deal, but Ebony was already red with embarrassment and begging to be taken downstairs. But Dante had other plans. Noticing that she was shoeless, he made the decision to carry her throughout the walk in his arms and headed towards the garden. Ebony was indignant and started to cringe, but she calmed down quickly enough and wrapped her arms around him, holding on to his strong back and shoulders. She noticed the mole on his neck and grinned softly. Dante was acting like a gallant man now, willing to take responsibility for her as more than just a ward. She just let him carry her wherever he needed to go. The Archduke announced that they had arrived. The girl turned around and saw a large glassed-in building in front of her, which seemed completely empty at the entrance. Descending independently from His Excellency's arms, she asked what they were doing here. Dante said he just wanted to show her around the place. The girl lightly touched the doors, behind which a bright light appeared, gradually enveloping her in a blinding glare. It was a beautiful hall, richly decorated with gold, moldings, and carpets. The lady leisurely descended the stairs and began to stroll there, enjoying the beauty unseen to her. Dante, watching her with a satisfied smile, said that he had never had the opportunity to use the hall before, but now he had an excuse. He proudly announced that this place would be the debut hall of Ebony Wannick's name at the height of the fall. A few days after this wonderful and unexpected news from the Archduke, Ebony decided to meet as Raven in town at one Jillian Meister restaurant to see how her collaboration with Mr. Juro was going. The restaurant she chose was where some noble guests gathered with their families to relax. The halls here are richly decorated, and the staff is dressed to the needle. Raven came in loudly, tapping her cane at the entrance and creaking the door, attracting the attention of Jillian, who had been waiting for her for some time and waving at her from the table, which had been set out in the manner of etiquette. She was genuinely happy, for she had much to discuss with her ally and friend. They sat down at the table and started talking. Jillian began to spill her guts about how she couldn't remember the last time she had closed her eyes, and Juro Vital kept criticizing her work. It turned out that the secretary was not just helping her with the paperwork, but was training her fully and demanding that she do it all herself. This was necessary so that next time she could do it without his supervision. But Lady Meister did not suspect that instead of the Archduke's principal respected secretary, she would be replaced by a grumpy, pedantic father who every time found some blunder in the documents. The letter lacked sincerity, the qualifications of the guarantors were questionable, or the stamps were not clear enough. Jillian banged her forehead on the table in frustration, drawing everyone's attention. People around her began to turn around and grumble about how a noblewoman could afford such behavior in public. But Jillian seemed to be more at ease, because before she was afraid to say a word. The widow expressed, in spite of all her sincere words of gratitude that she had wanted to say for so long. Raven waved it away, saying that she had done nothing of the sort, but had only introduced her to His Excellency the Archduke. But to Jillian, this was real proof that the lady before her was an outstanding broker, as well as her first honest ally, wishing her nothing but good and happiness. Raven then congratulated the widow wholeheartedly on her right to own the estate, which was a great credit to her too. Jillian smiled and took the girl's hand, enjoying the moment. However, there was something that bothered the widow. People still looked at her with contempt and misunderstanding. She caught those looks everywhere, even now as they sat peacefully chatting in the restaurant. Lady Meister admitted that she was still uncomfortable and asked her ally for advice on how to live when others think you're a leper. But Raven wasn't the least bit embarrassed or frightened by it. Then the widow suggested that such a brave girl might be frightened by something connected with her business, such as the failure of a deal or a bad review. Her words caused the masked lady to laugh, and she replied that even His Excellency the Archduke did not frighten her. As she closed her eyes, Raven admitted with a smile that her greatest fear was of becoming boring and ordinary, of becoming a mature woman accustomed to comfort, of becoming a stubborn, self-centered person, and then becoming stuck in the past and withdrawn. For her, it was the real end, degradation and deprivation of all the opportunities this world gave her. Jillian noted with admiration that the masked lady was very brave, and her courage could inspire others. She remembered that something similar had happened to mine. The widow realized that when she received the news of her husband's passing, the first thought that arose in her mind was that she had no one else to follow to survive. She had no idea that she would ever get back on her feet and walk her thorny, difficult road. Jillian has no defenders and protectors left. Her elderly husband had rescued her from a poor, greedy, and cruel family that was ready to strip her of every last rag. That's why it was impossible for her to even think about being free from someone else's care. And Lady Meister also told of one thing that she realized when she began to be educated in estate management. She realized how ignorant she had been all along, and how comfortable and at ease her life had been. She did not know of any rules and laws that she could use, and as a result, ways to protect herself and her property. But now she proudly announced that she had a purpose, a new and interesting stage in a life that had not previously stood out in any way. With a smile, Lady Meister declared that she would make every effort to preserve her wealth and increase it, and if there was life after death, she would one day meet her late husband and thank him for the way she had traveled. Raven liked the widow's plan, but Jillian kept repeating herself as she watched the waiter bring the drinks. It was the masked lady who had given her a chance, so Mrs. Meister had asked her to take care of her and teach her how to live the way Raven did. Ebony felt a warmth spread through her chest, enveloping her, filling her with pleasant sensations. The widow's words were not unfounded, for all the efforts of the masked lady and the one beneath her had paid off, making the girl who sat across from her truly happy. It was the best reward of all. Their heartfelt conversation was interrupted by the arrival, a little late, of a jeweler they already knew, Viscount Piet. The man lifted his hat and greeted the ladies with a smile. Raven immediately stood up and extended her hand for a handshake, expressing her joy at seeing him again. Jillian noticed this gesture and thought that although only men in their country greeted each other in this way, it looked very calm and natural to the masked lady, as if she had done it countless times before. The widow gathered her resolve, stood up, and, stammering slightly, greeted the jeweler, extending her hand to him as her friend had done. She introduced herself to the Viscount, and the man recognized her, remembering that she was the owner of the famous Meister estate. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and again gathering all the eyes in the restaurant room, sat down in their seats and began the small talk that is customary with any first acquaintance. Jillian, sipping her tea, began to ask about Nova, saying that she had heard about the beauty of that country, though she had not seen the scenery and towns in person. The Viscount said that it was a neighboring state, so it shouldn't take long to get there, and suggested that Jillian visit him there sometime. Raven, to ease the misunderstanding and awkwardness, explained to the foreigner that in Calcasieu, a married woman could not leave the house alone for a long time. Such were the customs here. The Viscount was embarrassed and immediately apologized for his ignorance, but the jeweler could not help noticing, even without hesitating to appear a vulgar foreigner, that such conservative, even, one might say, old-fashioned customs as those of Calcasieu were now a rarity. Such thoughts had crossed his mind before, when they had first met Raven and made their way to the Marquis of Sadel's club, where women, even with a great responsibility for the welfare of the country on their shoulders, were forbidden to enter such a private male place. Jillian was genuinely surprised to hear about the customs in Nova and how they differed. The Vicomte, sipping his tea casually, explained that for them it might seem like a bygone age, for his wife was a career woman in her own right. This made a great impression on the widow, for it was the first time she had ever heard of such luxury. The jeweler proudly revealed that his wife teaches history at the Academy for Nobles, and on the weekends she tutors the children at the orphanage. Raven quipped that his wife was amazing, but must be very busy. That's true, but Viscount, despite his desire for her to rest more, couldn't stop her from doing what she loved and make her stay at home when his wife had no idea how to sit still during her free hour. Jillian added, apologizing if it sounded indelicate, that when her husband was alive, he too had said that if the right to be trained by the best teachers were given to more people, if everyone had equal rights and opportunities in education, there would be many masters of their craft in Calcassus. The Viscount smilingly remarked that while we were on the subject, he couldn't help but mention Raven, thanks to whom he no longer had to worry about the success of the deal. The war is over, but the atmosphere on the border remains tense. so he had originally traveled to Kalkas fully prepared to back out. But now that he's back in Nova, he'll be sure to inform the merchants and advise them to find a broker named Raven. Jillian modestly added that without this mysterious lie, she could not have defended the estate, and Ebony, not knowing where to put herself from embarrassment, joked that they were praising her as if they were competing. By this point, the restaurant guests had dispersed, and Raven decided to cut to the chase. She said that she had actually invited them here to ask a favor, and then she took out 2 gold envelopes and handed them to the guests. They were invitations to a banquet in honor of Archduke Schneider's return. Jillian and Viscount opened the invitations, saying that they would definitely come to the event, and the jeweler was again surprised by Raven's connections, because earlier he had only heard of such a man and had never even hoped to see him at official receptions where he did not appear, and now he had the opportunity to greet him personally. Ebony smiled, pleased that both invitees had accepted the offer. The banquet in honor of Archduke Schneider's return, as well as Ebony's debutante Vonneck, was no more than 2 months away,